Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. On the first Sunday of July, 2007. On that day, a red Ford Focus that belonged to the missing Paige was discovered. However, the location where the car was found and its condition raised many questions and raised serious suspicions. The car was located in a remote area that Paige did not normally visit. Moreover, it was completely engulfed in flames of fire, suggesting that something terrible and strange had happened. The county district attorney of the county had been looking into what had happened with special scrutiny, and his preliminary findings indicated that the fire around the car was intentional. The conclusion was supported by the fact that nothing else had burned in the area. The unusual incident involving Paige Bergfeld's car was only the beginning of a much more complicated story. June 28, 2007 was a day that will always be remembered by Paige's family and friends. On this ordinary day, the young woman left her 3 children with friend Carol Linder home and left early in the morning. Nothing portended trouble, and no one could have imagined what would soon happen. Paige was a responsible mother, and always called or came to pick up her children on time. Morning came, but Paige never returned to pick up her children. Attentive friends and relatives began trying to contact her, but all to no avail. 8-year-old Jez, the eldest of her children, took the initiative in searching for the missing woman. After sending several messages to her mom's phone and getting no response, she insisted on searching. With Carol, they went to the police station, where Jez reported that her mom had not returned for her. This call to the police was a key point in the beginning of the police investigation and search for Paige Bergfeld. With each passing hour, the concern of Paige's loved ones only grew. The community was shocked by this mysterious disappearance, and many were willing to make every effort to help in the search for Paige. Thus began a massive public search operation to return this young woman to her children and loved ones. That same day, the missing woman's father, Frank Bergfeld, received a disturbing call from an official with the sheriff's department. The message was brief and shocking. His daughter had disappeared. It became clear to Frank that something serious had happened. He tried to contact Paige, but there was no response. Terrified and desperate, Frank called his oldest son, Craig, who was on the other side of the country. Craig didn't hesitate to buy a one-way ticket and arrived in town, ready to help in the search for his sister. Family and loved ones joined forces with police and volunteers to begin a massive search. People from different neighborhoods began searching for Paige, combing the surrounding area, checking every corner where they could find any trace of her whereabouts. The police began scrutinizing Paige's history with her loved ones to see if they had anything to do with her disappearance. Of course, authorities turned their attention to Paige's relationship with her first husband, Howard Bigler. The story of that relationship began during her high school years. After graduating from high school, Paige enrolled in nursing school at the University of Florida, where she met a young man named Howard Bigler. Their feelings for each other proved to be mutual, and they began dating. After successfully earning her nursing degree, Paige returned to Colorado. There, she continued to live with her family. But after some time, in 1995, she and Howard Bigler got married. At first glance, the spouses seemed to be a happy couple. They had many common interests and views on life. However, there was one significant rift in their relationship that eventually led to divorce. Paige dreamed of a child and wanted a family, however. Howard did not share her desire. The issue became a cause for arguments and conversations on numerous occasions. None of the attempts to find a compromise was not successful, and in 1997 the couple decided to part ways. Nevertheless, despite the divorce, their connection was strong and the former spouses remained friends. Paige later married Rob Dixon, but their marriage also ended in divorce. After her divorce from Rob, Paige resumed communication with Howard. The missing woman's first husband claimed that he was one of the last people to see Paige alive. On the 28th, they met up in Eagle County, Colorado. It was due to personal business. There, they spent Thursday together. The former spouses then returned to their respective cities. Howard confirmed that they continued to communicate by phone after the meeting. Also, upon learning of Paige's disappearance, Howard immediately contacted emergency services. While speaking to the operator, he expressed his deep concern and belief that something terrible had happened to Paige. He noted that she would never leave her children without a good reason. The phone recording was corroborated by cell tower data, showing that on the day Paige disappeared, Howard was in the Denver, Colorado area, which is several hours away from where she disappeared. This gave police officers reason to remove Howard from the list of suspects. Police began to scrupulously examine Paige's relationship with her second husband, Rob Dixon, and quickly uncovered many events that raised questions and warranted further investigation. It turned out that during their marriage, Paige had reported Rob to the police twice for harassment. After her divorce from her first husband, Paige took a job at a strip club in Denver, where she met Rob Dixon. The man was a wealthy man who had inherited a large fortune through his family's business. Having fallen in love with each other, Paige and Rob did not hesitate and in 1998 entered into marriage. The family settled in a luxurious home in Colorado, where Paige fulfilled her dream of becoming a mother. A few years later, the couple already had 3 children, which became for the young mom the most important thing in her life. The first years of marriage seemed happy. Paige and Rob were immersed in the world of luxury, leading a well-to-do lifestyle. Suddenly, however, things began to fall apart, and the reason for this was due to the financial difficulties Rob was facing. Some of his family's businesses had serious problems, and as a result, the economic situation in the family deteriorated so much that Rob was forced to file for bankruptcy. The financial collapse led to a deep family crisis. By 2004, family tensions had reached such a point that Paige contacted emergency services twice. The first time, she reported that Rob had threatened to kill her and the children, but by the time the police arrived, she and Rob claimed to have worked through their problems on their own. There was a second incident that was quite different. Paige reported Rob for assault while claiming that he hit her while she was holding her youngest child. This time, Rob was arrested and charged with third-degree assault. He eventually pleaded guilty to 1 count of molestation, but the trial was dismissed and Rob avoided jail time. The relationship between husband and wife was getting worse, and they decided to separate, after which Rob moved to Pennsylvania. Investigators interviewed Rob in an attempt to establish his alibi for the day Paige disappeared. Rob claimed that he was in his home and could not have harmed her. Ruling out his involvement in the disappearance, investigators could not. Rob eventually joined the search and was very active in trying to find Paige. Investigating officers spared no effort in an effort to find any clues to unravel this mysterious story and track down the missing mother. One of the first steps was a thorough examination of Paige's car. Based on the assumption that evidence could be found in the car that would help locate the woman, or at least understand what happened to her, Sergeant Weiler of the County Sheriff's Department said that arson is often used to destroy potential evidence. However, an examination of the vehicle provided experts with very valuable information. The driver's seat had been pushed back as far as it would go, indicating that the last person to drive the Ford was a tall man. Paige was short and couldn't have reached the pedals from that distance. In the trunk of the car, they found the missing woman's notebook, from which pages from June 26th through June 29th had been torn out. With each passing hour, the search for Paige grew more desperate. A few days after the burning car was discovered, a random driver stopped on a highway southeast of town for tire problems. A checkbook lying nearby caught his eye, and he immediately reported it to the authorities. While investigating that stretch of road, medical records, insurance cards, and other items belonging to Paige were also found. Sergeant Weiler discovered that several pages in the checkbook had been torn out, and the items were scattered a considerable distance apart. Most significant, however, was a business card found on the road. It became the key to revisiting the investigation. It turned out that Paige led a secret life that her loved ones had no idea about. According to the business card, the woman was an escort under the alias Carrie. This discovery called into question all previous assumptions in the investigation of Paige Bergfeld's disappearance. From that moment on, police officers were faced with new circumstances they had not even realized. After her divorce, Paige realized that from now on, she would have to work and earn as much as she could to provide for her children and meet their needs. She took a determined approach and started her own children's clothing business. At the same time, she taught dance lessons and sold kitchen supplies at a company. Despite her busy schedule, Paige always made time for her children, attended parent-teacher association meetings, and was active in school groups. A new discovery by the police turned the previous picture upside down. It turned out that Paige led a completely secretive life. She had a separate phone at her disposal, which she used for calls related to her professional activities. This phone became the key to unraveling a mystery that was far more complicated than even Paige's close friends and family could have imagined. Investigators' questions only multiplied. Why did such a conscientious mother and successful businesswoman decide to lead a double life? What did this secret profession have to do with her disappearance? All these questions became a priority in the investigation and added a new mystery to the investigation. Using a cell phone found in Paige's car, detectives accessed a list of contacts and calls made and received in the hours before the young woman's disappearance. The last call from that phone was made on June 28 at approximately 9 p.m. As a result of analyzing this information, 7 people were identified as suspects, and one of them was Lester Ralph Jones. Lester Jones's criminal history drew particular attention from investigators. He had a history of violence against a woman and kidnapping on his record. For the latter incident, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. However, that was not the only thing that alerted the police. His car was white in color, and from the external description was very similar to the car seen by Carol Paige's friend. Carol shared important information with the detectives. She recounted an incident where Paige approached her car one day and saw another white car nearby that was blocking her driveway. Outraged, she got behind the wheel to turn around and drive away, but the cars collided, except that the unknown driver immediately fled the scene. With this information, investigators speculated that Lester may have been obsessed with Paige and following her. Further investigation revealed that Lester Jones attempted to make an appointment with the day before she disappeared. Lester was questioned and denied having any information about Paige's disappearance. He provided fingerprints and DNA samples. However, many suspicious items were found in Lester's home, including a disposable cell phone, men's wigs, Viagra, a sheet with the phone number of an escort service, and women's lingerie in various sizes. The disposable cell phone attracted particular attention from investigators. Showed that on the day of her disappearance, someone tried to contact her several times from an unregistered number. Lester denied under questioning that he had a second cell phone. This meant he lied to the police. Using the packaging found at Lester's home, police were able to determine that the phone had nevertheless been purchased at a supermarket on North Avenue. Video footage from the store identified Lester as the purchaser. When he was shown the video footage, he refused to acknowledge that it depicted him. As a result of all this, Lester Jones became the prime suspect in Paige's disappearance. With no concrete evidence pointing to his guilt, the police continued to follow him and attempted to find Paige's body in order to have enough evidence to press charges. Case was put on hold for several years, and all the while, the young woman's family and loved ones were at a loss for grief. No one knew what had happened to the young mother, and the search seemed hopeless. The hope that Paige would be found alive was dwindling. That all changed in 2012, when a hiker accidentally stumbled upon human remains in a ravine among rocks and bushes in Delta County. The find was discovered very close to the road where Paige's personal belongings had been found 5 years earlier. Experts who arrived on the scene were almost certain that it was the body of a young mother. The experts ran a DNA test, and the results confirmed that it was Paige. But it was a grisly end to her story. The exact cause of death could not be determined due to the condition of the body, but it was found that Paige had been struck many times as several of her bones were broken, particularly the bones in her face. As a result, it was determined that she died from injuries sustained during the beating. This information added to the horrific drama of the story. Paige's body was underground, and due to years of soil erosion, ended up on the surface. This may explain why she was not discovered earlier. Lester Ralph Jones's case came to a halt for several years after Paige's remains were discovered. In November 2014, he was charged with kidnapping, first-degree murder, and second-degree murder. However, the trial didn't begin until July 2016 and lasted 22 days. Prosecutors argued that Lester, who already had a history of violence against women, was frustrated at not being able to see Paige after trying to get an appointment with her. The main witness for the prosecution was Lester's ex-wife, Lisa. She recounted how the man kidnapped her and threatened to kill her at gunpoint in the late 1990s. According to Lisa, Lester could not reconcile with her decision to break up with him. On one occasion, he attacked the couple with a gun in his hands, and Lisa's partner was shot in the head. A month later, Lester threatened her again, telling her that she would now end up at the bottom of a lake. However, the woman managed to escape and contacted police, leading to Lester's arrest on kidnapping and assault charges. Lester's defense attorneys tried to argue that the police detained an innocent man and suggested that Page's other potential clients may have also had a motive for the crime. However, they did not present convincing evidence linking other individuals to the murder. Lester's current spouse also appeared before the jury and argued that although he used an escort service, she did not abandon her husband because of her faith. However, she did not provide him with an alibi and identified him from a surveillance video at a supermarket where Lester was buying a disposable phone. On September 9, 2016, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict and the first trial was declared a mistrial. However, the district attorney was convinced of Lester's guilt and wasn't about to give up. Over the next few days, he worked diligently on the investigation and re-examined all the evidence. On November 21, 2016, after reviewing the evidence, the jury finally reached a verdict. Lester was found guilty of all charges in connection with Page's death. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. The defense appealed the sentence. An appeals court panel upheld the sentence and affirmed Lester's guilt. Page's final farewell was held on April 28, 2012. Her obituary dedicated beautiful words to her, describing her as a beautiful and radiant woman whose smile could be compared to the sun. Her tragic loss has left its mark on the hearts of her family and friends. Her 3 children were orphaned and had to endure the loss of their mother, who had always been their support and encouragement. Page's case attracted public attention and dragged on for many years, but still the persistence and perseverance of relatives and law enforcement finally brought justice. Lester Ralph Jones was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Now he will no longer be able to harm other people. Page's story serves as a reminder of the importance of endeavoring to fight for justice, even if it takes a lot of time and effort. Her memory will live on in the hearts of those who knew and loved her. Story 1. In 2016, one of the most shocking criminal cases in the United States unfolded with the story of the murder of 22-year-old Jessica Chambers. This case caught national attention and left a lasting impact on both the community of Panola County, Mississippi, and the wider public. It became widely known for the brutality of the crime and the subsequent trial that involved questions of justice, race, and the pursuit of truth. Jessica Chambers was a young woman who had been a cheerleader in high school, a well-liked and promising student. Her life, however, was tragically cut short in the small town of Cortland, Mississippi. On the night of December 6, 2014, Jessica was found badly burned and barely alive. She was discovered by a passing motorist who saw her walking down a road in flames. Her body was severely charred, and she was unable to walk properly, but she was still alive when emergency responders arrived at the scene. In the critical moments following her discovery, Jessica managed to speak to the paramedics and police officers, despite being in extreme pain. Her last words, which would later become a central piece of the investigation, were a mystery. She reportedly said Eric when asked who had done this to her, but she was unable to provide further details before she succumbed to her injuries in the hospital. The brutal nature of the attack shocked the entire nation. Jessica had been doused with gasoline and set on fire, leaving her to suffer in excruciating pain. The police immediately started an investigation into her murder, but there were several complications from the start. The most pressing issue was Jessica's limited ability to speak in her final moments. Her words pointing to someone named Eric only added confusion and uncertainty to the investigation. There were several individuals named Eric who had been in contact with Jessica in the past, but none of them seemed to have a clear motive to harm her. The local authorities, led by the Panola County Sheriff's Office, quickly launched an investigation into the case. They interviewed several witnesses and spoke to Jessica's friends and family members. However, the clues were sparse, and the investigation was slow. For months, the police struggled to piece together what had happened that night. They soon learned that Jessica had been seen with a man named Quentin Tellis, who had been in a relationship with her for a brief period before the murder. Tellis was reportedly one of the last people to have seen Jessica alive. Quentin Tellis was a 27-year-old man with a criminal record. He had been previously involved in a series of lesser crimes, but had never been convicted of anything as serious as murder. Despite his past, the authorities were drawn to him as a possible suspect due to the fact that he had been seen near Jessica's car the night of her death. Tellis also had a history of violence, which raised suspicions about his involvement in the crime. Detectives soon learned that Jessica's car had been found in a rural area, a short distance from where she had been discovered. Her vehicle appeared to have been abandoned, and there were no signs of a struggle inside. But the presence of gasoline near the car was highly suspicious and indicated that the crime was premeditated. This led the investigators to believe that the person responsible for the attack had planned it beforehand, further fueling the suspicion that Tellus may have been involved. In the months that followed, the police collected evidence that would eventually tie Tellus to the crime. They found traces of Jessica's blood on his clothes and phone records that showed he had been in communication with her on the night of the murder. However, there was still no concrete evidence to suggest that Tellus was the one who had actually set Jessica on fire. As the investigation continued, the authorities also had to deal with the emotional impact the case had on the local community. Cortland, a small town with a population of just over 500 people, was shaken to its core. The townspeople were in disbelief that such a brutal act could take place in their quiet, rural community. Many residents expressed frustration that the authorities had not yet made an arrest, and that the killer was still on the loose. Meanwhile, Jessica's family struggled with the painful loss of their daughter. Her mother, Lisa Chambers, became vocal in her determination to seek justice for Jessica. She demanded that the authorities work harder to find the person responsible for her daughter's death. As time passed, it became clear that this case would not be solved quickly, and the search for answers seemed to drag on endlessly. As more information about Quentin Tellus came to light, the case became even more complex. Tellus's defense team argued that there was no clear motive for him to kill Jessica, and they suggested that the police were making him a scapegoat for the crime. The situation only grew more tense as the case gained national media attention. It became one of the most publicized criminal investigations in Mississippi during that year, and people from across the country closely followed the twists and turns of the case. In the next pages, we will continue to explore the investigation into Jessica Chambers' death and the trial that followed. This case was not only about seeking justice for a young woman who lost her life in a horrific manner, but also about confronting issues of race, the criminal justice system, and the complexities of solving violent crimes in small towns. The answers would not come easily, and the events that followed would reveal the dark side of the pursuit for truth and accountability. As the investigation into Jessica Chambers' murder deepened, the authorities were faced with a series of challenges that made solving the case difficult. The evidence was circumstantial, and the lack of definitive proof meant that investigators had to rely on eyewitness testimonies and forensic evidence to piece together the truth. The case took on a particularly high profile, with national media coverage adding pressure on law enforcement to solve the mystery quickly. Quentin Tellus, the man at the center of the investigation, became a key figure in the case. His past relationship with Jessica Chambers made him a primary suspect. However, his defense team was quick to argue that the evidence against him was weak, and they questioned the reliability of the witnesses and forensic analysis. The fact that Jessica's final words pointed to a man named Eric further muddied the waters, leaving the investigation in a state of confusion. The investigators worked tirelessly to uncover any connections between Tellus and the murder. One crucial piece of evidence that emerged was a video recording from a local gas station. The footage showed Tellus and Jessica together at the station earlier on the evening of her death. This was a key piece of the puzzle, as it placed Tellus in close proximity to Jessica on the night she was attacked. While it was not conclusive evidence of his involvement in the crime, it raised questions that could not be ignored. Moreover, Tellus' phone records were examined, revealing a series of calls and messages exchanged between him and Jessica on the night of the murder. However, the investigators were unable to conclusively determine what the nature of their conversation was, as the exact contents of their communication were not available. Nevertheless, the authorities found it highly suspicious that Tellus was in contact with Jessica, especially considering the fact that she had been found just hours later in a burned and disfigured state. In addition to the phone records, forensic analysis of Tellus' clothing uncovered traces of Jessica's blood. This evidence seemed to provide a direct link between the suspect and the victim. The bloodstains were found on Tellus' pants and shoes, which further raised doubts about his claims of innocence. However, Tellus continued to deny any involvement in the crime. He claimed that he had not seen Jessica since they had briefly interacted at the gas station, insisting that he was not responsible for her death. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, the case remained far from straightforward. One of the challenges faced by investigators was the absence of any direct witnesses who could confirm what happened in the hours leading up to Jessica's death. The nature of the crime, Jessica being doused with gasoline and set on fire, made it difficult to establish a clear timeline of events. Furthermore, Jessica's inability to provide more detailed information due to her injuries left a significant gap in the investigation. The prosecution faced a difficult task in building a case against Tellis. While the circumstantial evidence was compelling, it was not enough to guarantee a conviction. The defense team seized upon this uncertainty, arguing that there was not enough concrete proof to link Tellis directly to the murder. In their view, the prosecution was relying too heavily on circumstantial evidence, which was often considered weak in the eyes of the law. As the investigation unfolded, another significant development occurred. A potential witness came forward with a startling claim. A woman named Brooke O'Bannon alleged that she had seen Tellis on the night of the murder, near the scene where Jessica's car had been abandoned. O'Bannon's testimony suggested that Tellis had been in the area at the time of the crime, and she described seeing him with a lighter. While her testimony was significant, it was not definitive enough to provide conclusive evidence that Tellis had committed the murder. The conflicting witness accounts and lack of direct evidence left the case in a state of limbo. For Jessica's family, the prolonged uncertainty was devastating. Lisa Chambers, Jessica's mother, became a vocal advocate for justice, using her platform to demand answers and push for a resolution. She appeared on television interviews and in the media, urging the public to support her efforts to find her daughter's killer. Her calls for justice resonated with many, as the case had touched a nerve in the broader community. In 2016, the investigation took another turn when the police arrested Quentin Tellis in connection with the murder of Jessica Chambers. The arrest came after months of gathering evidence, and it was seen as a breakthrough in the case. Tellis was charged with capital murder, and he faced the possibility of life in prison or the death penalty if convicted. The arrest brought a sense of relief to Jessica's family, who had been waiting for justice since the night of her daughter's death. However, the legal process was far from over. As Tellis prepared for trial, questions about the sufficiency of the evidence against him continued to linger. The defense team maintained that Tellis was innocent and that the prosecution's case was based on speculation rather than hard facts. The trial that followed would become one of the most highly publicized criminal cases in Mississippi, as it would not only determine Tellis's fate, but also shed light on the complexities of the American criminal justice system. While the legal proceedings moved forward, the case continued to have a profound impact on the community of Cortland and the surrounding areas. Residents were divided in their opinions about Tellis's guilt or innocence, and the case sparked heated debates about race, class, and the effectiveness of the criminal justice system in small towns. It was a stark reminder that even in the most rural and seemingly peaceful parts of the country, brutal crimes could occur, leaving a trail of pain and confusion in their wake. The murder of Jessica Chambers also drew attention to broader societal issues, including the challenges of investigating and prosecuting violent crimes in under-resourced communities. In a town like Cortland, where resources were limited and law enforcement had to contend with a small budget and a lack of manpower, solving a high-profile case like this one was an immense challenge. It highlighted the difficulties that local police departments face when dealing with complex and high-stakes investigations, particularly when they involve such horrific crimes. As the case approached trial, the public's interest in Jessica's story grew. People from all over the country were following the case, hoping for justice to be served and answers to emerge. The trial would become the next chapter in a long and painful journey for Jessica's family, the community of Cortland, and everyone involved in the search for truth. The trial of Quentin Tellis began in 2017, and it quickly became one of the most highly anticipated criminal proceedings in Mississippi. The courtroom was filled with media personnel, family members of the victim, and supporters of both the prosecution and the defense. The case had garnered national attention, and many were eager to see whether justice would be served in the brutal murder of Jessica Chambers. The prosecution's case against Tellis rested heavily on circumstantial evidence, as there was no direct eyewitness testimony that could conclusively prove he was responsible for the crime. They argued that the blood found on his clothing, his presence at the gas station with Jessica earlier that evening, and the phone records showing communication between him and the victim were enough to establish his involvement. Furthermore, the prosecution pointed to the video footage from the gas station, which showed Tellis and Jessica together, as a key piece of evidence. The defense, however, worked hard to dismantle the prosecution's case. They argued that the evidence was inconclusive, and that there was no definitive proof linking Tellis to Jessica's murder. They also pointed out the uncertainties surrounding Jessica's final words, which only identified someone named Eric. Since there was no confirmation that Tellis was the person Jessica had been referring to, the defense questioned whether the prosecution's theory about his involvement was based on speculation rather than solid facts. A central part of the defense's strategy was to challenge the reliability of the witnesses. The defense cast doubt on the testimony of Brooke O'Bannon, who had claimed to have seen Tellis near the scene of the crime with a lighter. They argued that O'Bannon's recollection was unreliable and that there were too many inconsistencies in her account to make her testimony credible. Furthermore, they questioned whether it was even possible for Tellis to have been the person who set Jessica on fire, given the circumstances and the lack of physical evidence proving his direct involvement. The most significant challenge for the prosecution was the lack of a clear motive for Tellis to have killed Jessica. While Jessica's family and friends testified about their relationship with her and the emotional toll of the crime, the prosecution was unable to provide any definitive explanation for why Tellis would have chosen to commit such a violent act. In a case like this, the absence of a clear motive made it difficult to present a convincing argument that would compel the jury to find Tellis guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Throughout the trial, Jessica's mother, Lisa Chambers, remained a visible and vocal presence in the courtroom. She had spent years fighting for justice for her daughter, and now she was determined to see the trial through to the end. Lisa Chambers' emotional testimony about the loss of her daughter resonated deeply with those in the courtroom, and her strength in the face of such tragedy made it clear that her fight for justice was far from over. As the trial proceeded, the defense pointed out multiple inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, particularly regarding the forensic evidence. There were questions about whether the blood found on Tellis' clothing had been properly handled during the investigation, and the defense suggested that it could have been planted or improperly tested. Additionally, they argued that the gas station footage was not clear enough to definitively identify Tellis as being the person seen with Jessica, and they questioned whether the footage could be misinterpreted. The jury, tasked with making a decision on the guilt or innocence of Quentin Tellis, deliberated for hours. The trial had been a long and complicated process, with no clear-cut answers to the questions at hand. The circumstantial evidence presented by the prosecution was compelling, but it was not enough to completely rule out reasonable doubt. The defense had successfully raised concerns about the quality of the evidence and the reliability of the witnesses. Finally, after days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Quentin Tellis was found not guilty of the murder of Jessica Chambers. The courtroom erupted in shock, and there were emotional reactions from both the prosecution and the defense. For Lisa Chambers and her family, the verdict was a devastating blow. After years of fighting for justice, they were left without the closure they had desperately sought. The decision left many people in the courtroom questioning whether the system had failed Jessica and her family. Despite the not guilty verdict, the case did not end there. The prosecution had always maintained that Quentin Tellis was guilty of Jessica's murder, and they vowed to continue seeking justice. However, the case highlighted significant issues with the criminal justice system, particularly in terms of the challenges of prosecuting violent crimes with limited evidence. The trial exposed the complexities of criminal investigations, and many observers wondered if there was more to the story than had been revealed during the proceedings. In the years following the trial, Jessica's murder continued to be a topic of discussion in the media and within the local community. Some believed that justice had been served, while others felt that the case remained unsolved. The tragedy of Jessica's death and the long, painful fight for justice left a deep scar on her family and the small town of Cortland. As of now, the murder of Jessica Chambers remains an unsolved mystery in the eyes of many. Despite the not guilty verdict, questions still linger about what truly happened on the night of her death. The case serves as a reminder of the complexities and uncertainties inherent in the criminal justice system, especially in cases where the evidence is limited and the answers are difficult to find. For Jessica's family, the search for justice continues, even as the years go by. Let's jump to next story. Story 2. In 2016, one of the most shocking and tragic criminal events took place in the United States, involving the murder of 22-year-old Jessica Chambers. This case, which occurred in the small town of Cortland, Mississippi, captured national attention due to its brutal nature and the complexity of the investigation. The murder not only shocked the tight-knit community of Cortland, but it also raised questions about justice, race, and the legal system in the United States. Jessica Chambers was a young woman with a bright future ahead of her. She was well-liked in her community, known for her kind personality and her close relationship with her family and friends. Jessica had been a cheerleader in high school and was attending college in the nearby city of South Haven. On December 6, 2014, her life was abruptly taken away in a horrific crime that would send shockwaves through her hometown and the rest of the country. That evening, Jessica was found severely burned and barely alive in a rural area just outside of Cortland. She had been set on fire, and her body was almost completely covered in burns. A passerby found her on the side of the road and immediately called 911. Emergency responders rushed to the scene and transported Jessica to the hospital, but her injuries were so severe that she was unable to survive. However, before she succumbed to her injuries, Jessica was able to utter a few words that would later become key to solving the case. When paramedics arrived and began treating her, they asked her who had done this to her. Jessica, in a barely audible voice, managed to say the name Eric when asked about the person responsible for the attack. Those final words were the only clue the investigators had to go on. The fact that Jessica had been able to identify her attacker in such a limited state was both puzzling and crucial to the investigation. However, the mystery surrounding the name Eric would prove to be one of the most complicated aspects of the case. The name Eric did not immediately point to any one person in Jessica's life. There were multiple individuals with that name who had interacted with her in the past. Investigators quickly realized that they had to dig deeper into Jessica's relationships and contacts to determine who this Eric might be. They began interviewing people who knew Jessica, including her family, friends, and acquaintances, but no one seemed to have a clear understanding of who this person might be. Meanwhile, the investigation into the circumstances of Jessica's death was ongoing. The authorities examined her car, which had been found abandoned near the scene where she was discovered. There was no sign of a struggle in the vehicle, and it was not immediately clear how Jessica had ended up in the state she was in. The fact that she had been set on fire pointed to a calculated, premeditated attack, leading investigators to believe that her killer had gone to great lengths to make sure that she was not able to escape. As the investigation continued, the local sheriff's office and other law enforcement agencies, including the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation, began focusing on Jessica's social circle and relationships. It became clear that Jessica had been in contact with a man named Quentin Tellis, a 27-year-old from the area who had previously been in a romantic relationship with her. Tellis had a criminal record and was no stranger to law enforcement, though he had not been involved in anything as serious as murder before. Tellis was quickly identified as a person of interest in the case. According to various accounts, he had been in contact with Jessica in the days leading up to her death, and he had been seen in the vicinity of her car shortly before the attack. Investigators found that Tellis and Jessica had exchanged phone calls and text messages on the night of her death, which raised suspicions about his involvement in the crime. However, there were problems with the investigation. Although Quentin Tellis was an obvious suspect due to his connection with Jessica, there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. The name Eric that Jessica had mentioned in her final moments remained a mystery, and it was unclear if Tellis was the person she was referring to. Furthermore, Tellis denied any involvement in the murder, claiming that he had not seen Jessica on the night of her death. He stated that they had briefly exchanged words at a gas station earlier in the day, but he insisted that he was not responsible for what had happened to her. Despite these denials, the investigation continued to focus on Quentin Tellis. The authorities uncovered additional evidence that seemed to connect him to Jessica's murder. Bloodstains found on Tellis' clothing were identified as being Jessica's. This discovery raised further suspicions, and the evidence seemed to point toward Tellis as the likely perpetrator. However, the police were still unsure whether this was enough to secure a conviction. In addition to the blood evidence, investigators also discovered video footage from a local gas station showing Jessica and Tellis together earlier in the day. The footage was not clear enough to provide any direct proof of Tellis' involvement in the attack, but it did place him in the same area as Jessica shortly before the murder. This raised even more questions about Tellis' involvement in the crime. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this was no ordinary murder case. The brutality of the crime, the lack of direct evidence, and the ambiguous nature of Jessica's final words left law enforcement in a difficult position. They had a suspect, but the evidence was circumstantial, and the mystery of the name, Eric, lingered over the entire case. For Jessica's family, the uncertainty was unbearable. Her mother, Lisa Chambers, became an outspoken advocate for justice, demanding that law enforcement do everything they could to find the person responsible for her daughter's death. She appeared in media interviews, speaking passionately about the pain of losing her daughter and her determination to see justice served. As the investigation progressed and more details emerged, it became clear that this case would not be solved quickly. It would take years before the true identity of Jessica's killer was revealed, and even then, the pursuit of justice would be fraught with complications. This case would evolve into a highly publicized trial, where issues of race, justice, and the criminal system would be brought into sharp focus. But for now, the investigation into the death of Jessica Chambers continued, with investigators working tirelessly to uncover the truth behind her murder and bring those responsible to justice. The investigation into the murder of Jessica Chambers took many twists and turns, and it soon became evident that finding conclusive evidence to link Quentin Tellis to the crime would not be easy. Despite the circumstantial evidence pointing toward Tellis, the case lacked a clear and undeniable motive. The authorities continued to examine every lead, but with each passing day, the mystery surrounding Jessica's death deepened. One of the major challenges the investigators faced was the lack of direct eyewitness testimony. While Jessica had managed to utter the name Eric in her final moments, no one could confirm who exactly this Eric was. Several individuals with the name Eric had been in Jessica's life, but none seemed to fit the profile of someone who would commit such a brutal act. Investigators found it especially frustrating that Jessica's final words were so vague, leaving them with little to work with as they tried to piece together the puzzle. Despite these obstacles, the authorities continued to focus on Quentin Tellis. Tellis had a criminal record, which made him a suspect in the eyes of law enforcement. He had a history of run-ins with the law, but none of his previous offenses were as serious as a murder. Nevertheless, the connection between Tellis and Jessica was undeniable. The two had spent time together before the murder, and there were reports that they had been in a brief romantic relationship. One of the significant pieces of evidence that the investigators discovered was the surveillance video from a local gas station. The footage showed Jessica and Tellis interacting in the hours leading up to her death. The video didn't show the actual crime, but it did confirm that Tellis and Jessica had been in close proximity shortly before she was found. The video also raised questions about the nature of their relationship and what had transpired between them. Along with the gas station video, the police obtained phone records that indicated Jessica and Tellis had been in contact on the night of her death. The calls and text messages exchanged between them were not enough to confirm the details of their interactions, but they did suggest that Tellis had been in communication with Jessica during the critical hours leading up to the attack. This, combined with the surveillance footage, was enough to make him a primary suspect, though it was still not enough to definitively prove that he had committed the crime. In addition to the phone records, forensic evidence played a major role in the investigation. Blood found on Tellis' clothing was identified as Jessica's. This was a critical piece of evidence, as it indicated that Tellis had been in close contact with Jessica at some point after the attack. The presence of her blood on his clothing strongly suggested that he had played a role in her death. However, Tellis denied any involvement, claiming that the blood had somehow ended up on his clothes without him being responsible for the crime. Despite his denials, the blood evidence was enough to secure an arrest. In February 2016, Quentin Tellis was charged with capital murder. The arrest brought a sense of relief to Jessica's family, who had been struggling with the uncertainty surrounding her death. But the legal process was just beginning, and many questions remained unanswered. The arrest of Tellis marked the beginning of a lengthy and complicated legal process. Tellis was initially held without bail as he awaited trial. Throughout the proceedings, his defense team argued that there was insufficient evidence to charge him with murder. They maintained that the circumstantial evidence was not enough to establish Tellis' guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They also pointed out that Jessica's final words, though significant, were far from conclusive and did not prove that Tellis had been the one who attacked her. As the trial approached, the public's interest in the case grew. The media, particularly in Mississippi, began to cover the story extensively, focusing on the shocking nature of the crime and the ensuing investigation. Jessica's family, especially her mother Lisa Chambers, became vocal advocates for justice, using the media to bring attention to her daughter's death and the need for the truth to be revealed. In addition to the legal proceedings, the trial brought to light some of the deeper, more uncomfortable issues surrounding the case. The question of race played a significant role, as Jessica Chambers was a young white woman and Quentin Tellis was a black man. Some observers speculated that racial dynamics could have played a part in how the case was perceived and how the investigation unfolded. The town of Cortland, where the crime occurred, was predominantly African American, and the case stirred discussions about race relations, law enforcement, and the treatment of suspects in the criminal justice system. Throughout the trial, both the prosecution and the defense presented their arguments. The prosecution focused on the blood evidence, the phone records, and the gas station video to argue that Tellis had been involved in the murder. They painted a picture of a calculated, premeditated attack, suggesting that Tellis had planned the crime in advance. The prosecution also emphasized the brutality of the murder. Jessica had been set on fire, a horrific method of killing that indicated a high degree of violence and cruelty. The defense, on the other hand, sought to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. They argued that there were inconsistencies in the evidence, and that the prosecution had failed to prove Tellis' guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They claimed that the blood on Tellis' clothing could have been transferred in ways that did not involve him committing the murder. They also pointed out that Jessica's final words were not definitive enough to identify him as the killer. Furthermore, they argued that there were other possible suspects who had not been properly investigated. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the case would not be easy to resolve. The prosecution had presented a strong case, but the defense had raised enough questions about the evidence to make the jury doubt Tellis' guilt. The fact that there was no clear motive for the crime and the lack of direct proof made the case even more complicated. The jury would have to weigh the evidence carefully and determine whether it was enough to convict Tellis. For Jessica's family, the trial was an emotionally taxing experience. Lisa Chambers, in particular, struggled to come to terms with her daughter's death while facing the challenges of the legal process. She continued to advocate for justice, hoping that the truth would eventually come to light. The trial became not just a legal battle, but an emotional journey for her and the rest of Jessica's family, who had to endure the public scrutiny and the painful reminder of the brutal way in which they had lost their loved one. The trial of Quentin Tellis finally began in early 2017, and it became one of the most widely covered cases in Mississippi that year. The courtroom was filled with reporters, family members, and members of the public who had been following the case since Jessica Chambers' tragic death in 2014. The pressure on both the prosecution and the defense was immense, as they prepared to present their cases to the jury, who would ultimately decide whether Quentin Tellis was guilty of Jessica's brutal murder. The prosecution's strategy was to emphasize the strong circumstantial evidence against Tellis. They presented the blood found on his clothes as a significant piece of evidence, linking him directly to Jessica's injuries. They also showcased phone records that demonstrated communication between Tellis and Jessica on the night of her death, suggesting that the two had been in contact in the hours leading up to the attack. The video footage from the gas station showing Tellis and Jessica together earlier that evening was another important piece of evidence. While this video did not show the crime itself, it established that the two had interacted shortly before her death, strengthening the prosecution's argument that Tellis had been involved. Additionally, the prosecution emphasized Jessica's final words, where she managed to identify a man named Eric. While it remained unclear if Tellis was the Eric she referred to, the prosecution argued that there was enough circumstantial evidence to suggest that he was likely the one responsible for the attack. The brutal nature of the crime, Jessica had been set on fire, further supported the prosecution's theory that the murder was premeditated and deliberate. The authorities believed that Tellis had orchestrated the crime, seeking revenge or a form of retribution for reasons that were still unclear. However, the defense team worked relentlessly to undermine the prosecution's case. They argued that the evidence was far from conclusive, and that there was not enough direct proof to link Tellis to the murder beyond a reasonable doubt. One of the central points in their defense was the vagueness of Jessica's final words. While she had mentioned the name Eric, the defense pointed out that this alone could not definitively identify Quentin Tellis as the killer. They questioned whether Jessica had accurately identified her attacker, given her severely burned state and the trauma she had experienced. The defense also challenged the forensic evidence, specifically the blood found on Tellis' clothing. They argued that there was no direct proof to show how the blood had been transferred to his clothing. The defense suggested that it was possible that the blood could have been from a different source, and they criticized the police for failing to rule out other potential explanations. Additionally, they attacked the reliability of the witnesses, including the testimony of Brooke O'Bannon, who had claimed to have seen Tellis near the scene of the crime. The defense contended that O'Bannon's recollection was flawed, and that her testimony could not be trusted as definitive evidence. Another point the defense raised was the lack of a clear motive for Tellis to kill Jessica. They argued that there was no obvious reason for him to commit such a violent and horrific act. They contended that the prosecution's theory of premeditated murder lacked substance, as there were no clear indications of animosity or conflict between Tellis and Jessica in the days leading up to the murder. This lack of motive was one of the main points of contention in the trial, as the defense sought to convince the jury that Tellis had no reason to kill Jessica. As the trial continued, both sides presented their arguments in an emotional and tense atmosphere. For Jessica's family, the pain of reliving the events surrounding her death was overwhelming. Her mother, Lisa Chambers, continued to speak out for justice, appearing in the media and maintaining her resolve to see her daughter's killer held accountable. The emotional toll on the family was immense, and the trial added to their grief, as they were forced to endure the details of Jessica's brutal death in a public courtroom. Finally, after several weeks of testimony, the jury began deliberating. The evidence was complex, and the case had raised numerous questions that made it difficult to reach a clear conclusion. While the prosecution had presented strong circumstantial evidence, there were enough uncertainties and gaps in the case for the defense to argue that Tellis should not be convicted. As the jury deliberated, there was a sense of anticipation as the community, Jessica's family, and those following the case anxiously awaited the outcome. After a tense deliberation period, the jury returned with a verdict. Quentin Tellis was found not guilty of capital murder. The decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond, leaving many stunned by the outcome. Jessica's family, particularly her mother, was devastated. For Lisa Chambers, the verdict was a heartbreaking blow, as she had spent years fighting for justice for her daughter. The case had taken a heavy toll on her family, and the not guilty verdict left them grappling with a sense of unfinished business and a deep sense of loss. Despite the not guilty verdict, the case continued to stir debate within the community and the broader public. Many believed that Tellis was responsible for Jessica's death, while others felt that the evidence presented was not sufficient to secure a conviction. The case raised important questions about the criminal justice system and the challenges of prosecuting violent crimes with limited evidence. For Jessica's family, the lack of closure meant that their fight for justice would continue, even as the legal system had given its final decision. In the aftermath of the trial, Jessica's murder remained an unsolved mystery in the eyes of many. The case highlighted the limitations of circumstantial evidence and the difficulty of obtaining a conviction when there are gaps in the story and conflicting witness testimonies. The pain of Jessica's death continued to resonate with her family, who were left without the answers they had been hoping for. The case also underscored the complexity of criminal investigations and trials, where justice is not always clear-cut and where the search for truth can take years, if not decades. As of now, the murder of Jessica Chambers remains one of the most notorious unsolved crimes in Mississippi's recent history. Despite the not guilty verdict, the case continues to haunt the community of Cortland and those who followed the investigation. For Jessica's family, the journey for justice remains ongoing, and the memory of her tragic death is a painful reminder of how sometimes, even when all seems clear, the pursuit of justice can be a long and uncertain road. Let's jump to next story. Story 3. In 2016, one of the most shocking and tragic criminal events took place in the United States, involving the murder of 22-year-old Jessica Chambers. This case, which occurred in the small town of Cortland, Mississippi, captured national attention due to its brutal nature and the complexity of the investigation. The murder not only shocked the tight-knit community of Cortland, but it also raised questions about justice, race, and the legal system in the United States. Jessica Chambers was a young woman with a bright future ahead of her. She was well-liked in her community, known for her kind personality and her close relationship with her family and friends. Jessica had been a cheerleader in high school and was attending college in the nearby city of South Haven. On December 6, 2014, her life was abruptly taken away in a horrific crime that would send shockwaves through her hometown and the rest of the country. That evening, Jessica was found severely burned and barely alive in a rural area just outside of Cortland. She had been set on fire, and her body was almost completely covered in burns. A passerby found her on the side of the road and immediately called 911. Emergency responders rushed to the scene and transported Jessica to the hospital, but her injuries were so severe that she was unable to survive. However, before she succumbed to her injuries, Jessica was able to utter a few words that would later become key to solving the case. When paramedics arrived and began treating her, they asked her who had done this to her. Jessica, in a barely audible voice, managed to say the name Eric when asked about the person responsible for the attack. Those final words were the only clue the investigators had to go on. The fact that Jessica had been able to identify her attacker in such a limited state was both puzzling and crucial to the investigation. However, the mystery surrounding the name Eric would prove to be one of the most complicated aspects of the case. The name Eric did not immediately point to any one person in Jessica's life. There were multiple individuals with that name who had interacted with her in the past. Investigators quickly realized that they had to dig deeper into Jessica's relationships and contacts to determine who this Eric might be. They began interviewing people who knew Jessica, including her family, friends, and acquaintances, but no one seemed to have a clear understanding of who this person might be. Meanwhile, the investigation into the circumstances of Jessica's death was ongoing. The authorities examined her car, which had been found abandoned near the scene where she was discovered. There was no sign of a struggle in the vehicle, and it was not immediately clear how Jessica had ended up in the state she was in. The fact that she had been set on fire pointed to a calculated, premeditated attack, leading investigators to believe that her killer had gone to great lengths to make sure that she was not able to escape. As the investigation continued, the local sheriff's office and other law enforcement agencies, including the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation, began focusing on Jessica's social circle and relationships. It became clear that Jessica had been in contact with a man named Quentin Tellis, a 27-year-old from the area who had previously been in a romantic relationship with her. Tellis had a criminal record and was no stranger to law enforcement, though he had not been involved in anything as serious as murder before. Tellis was quickly identified as a person of interest in the case. According to various accounts, he had been in contact with Jessica in the days leading up to her death, and he had been seen in the vicinity of her car shortly before the attack. Investigators found that Tellis and Jessica had exchanged phone calls and text messages on the night of her death, which raised suspicions about his involvement in the crime. However, there were problems with the investigation. Although Quentin Tellis was an obvious suspect due to his connection with Jessica, there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. The name Eric that Jessica had mentioned in her final moments remained a mystery, and it was unclear if Tellis was the person she was referring to. Furthermore, Tellis denied any involvement in the murder, claiming that he had not seen Jessica on the night of her death. He stated that they had briefly exchanged words at a gas station earlier in the day, but he insisted that he was not responsible for what had happened to her. Despite these denials, the investigation continued to focus on Quentin Tellis. The authorities uncovered additional evidence that seemed to connect him to Jessica's murder. Bloodstains found on Tellis' clothing were identified as being Jessica's. This discovery raised further suspicions, and the evidence seemed to point toward Tellis as the likely perpetrator. However, the police were still unsure whether this was enough to secure a conviction. In addition to the blood evidence, investigators also discovered video footage from a local gas station showing Jessica and Tellis together earlier in the day. The footage was not clear enough to provide any direct proof of Tellis' involvement in the attack, but it did place him in the same area as Jessica shortly before the murder. This raised even more questions about Tellis' involvement in the crime. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this was no ordinary murder case. The brutality of the crime, the lack of direct evidence, and the ambiguous nature of Jessica's final words left law enforcement in a difficult position. They had a suspect, but the evidence was circumstantial, and the mystery of the name, Eric, lingered over the entire case. For Jessica's family, the uncertainty was unbearable. Her mother, Lisa Chambers, became an outspoken advocate for justice, demanding that law enforcement do everything they could to find the person responsible for her daughter's death. She appeared in media interviews, speaking passionately about the pain of losing her daughter and her determination to see justice served. As the investigation progressed and more details emerged, it became clear that this case would not be solved quickly. It would take years before the true identity of Jessica's killer was revealed, and even then, the pursuit of justice would be fraught with complications. This case would evolve into a highly publicized trial, where issues of race, justice, and the criminal system would be brought into sharp focus. But for now, the investigation into the death of Jessica Chambers continued, with investigators working tirelessly to uncover the truth behind her murder and bring those responsible to justice. The investigation into the murder of Jessica Chambers took many twists and turns, and it soon became evident that finding conclusive evidence to link Quentin Tellis to the crime would not be easy. Despite the circumstantial evidence pointing toward Tellis, the case lacked a clear and undeniable motive. The authorities continued to examine every lead, but with each passing day, the mystery surrounding Jessica's death deepened. One of the major challenges the investigators faced was the lack of direct eyewitness testimony. While Jessica had managed to utter the name Eric in her final moments, no one could confirm who exactly this Eric was. Several individuals with the name Eric had been in Jessica's life, but none seemed to fit the profile of someone who would commit such a brutal act. Investigators found it especially frustrating that Jessica's final words were so vague, leaving them with little to work with as they tried to piece together the puzzle. Despite these obstacles, the authorities continued to focus on Quentin Tellis. Tellis had a criminal record, which made him a suspect in the eyes of law enforcement. He had a history of run-ins with the law, but none of his previous offenses were as serious as a murder. Nevertheless, the connection between Tellis and Jessica was undeniable. The two had spent time together before the murder, and there were reports that they had been in a brief romantic relationship. One of the significant pieces of evidence that the investigators discovered was the surveillance video from a local gas station. The footage showed Jessica and Tellis interacting in the hours leading up to her death. The video didn't show the actual crime, but it did confirm that Tellis and Jessica had been in close proximity shortly before she was found. The video also raised questions about the nature of their relationship and what had transpired between them. Along with the gas station video, the police obtained phone records that indicated Jessica and Tellis had been in contact on the night of her death. The calls and text messages exchanged between them were not enough to confirm the details of their interactions, but they did suggest that Tellis had been in communication with Jessica during the critical hours leading up to the attack. This, combined with the surveillance footage, was enough to make him a primary suspect, though it was still not enough to definitively prove that he had committed the crime. In addition to the phone records, forensic evidence played a major role in the investigation. Blood found on Tellis' clothing was identified as Jessica's. This was a critical piece of evidence, as it indicated that Tellis had been in close contact with Jessica at some point after the attack. The presence of her blood on his clothing strongly suggested that he had played a role in her death. However, Tellis denied any involvement, claiming that the blood had somehow ended up on his clothes without him being responsible for the crime. Despite his denials, the blood evidence was enough to secure an arrest. In February 2016, Quentin Tellis was charged with capital murder. The arrest brought a sense of relief to Jessica's family, who had been struggling with the uncertainty surrounding her death. But the legal process was just beginning, and many questions remained unanswered. The arrest of Tellis marked the beginning of a lengthy and complicated legal process. Tellis was initially held without bail as he awaited trial. Throughout the proceedings, his defense team argued that there was insufficient evidence to charge him with murder. They maintained that the circumstantial evidence was not enough to establish Tellis' guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They also pointed out that Jessica's final words, though significant, were far from conclusive and did not prove that Tellis had been the one who attacked her. As the trial approached, the public's interest in the case grew. The media, particularly in Mississippi, began to cover the story extensively, focusing on the shocking nature of the crime and the ensuing investigation. Jessica's family, especially her mother Lisa Chambers, became vocal advocates for justice, using the media to bring attention to her daughter's death and the need for the truth to be revealed. In addition to the legal proceedings, the trial brought to light some of the deeper, more uncomfortable issues surrounding the case. The question of race played a significant role, as Jessica Chambers was a young white woman and Quentin Tellis was a black man. Some observers speculated that racial dynamics could have played a part in how the case was perceived and how the investigation unfolded. The town of Cortland, where the crime occurred, was predominantly African American, and the case stirred discussions about race relations, law enforcement, and the treatment of suspects in the criminal justice system. Throughout the trial, both the prosecution and the defense presented their arguments. The prosecution focused on the blood evidence the phone records, and the gas station video to argue that Tellis had been involved in the murder. They painted a picture of a calculated, premeditated attack, suggesting that Tellis had planned the crime in advance. The prosecution also emphasized the brutality of the murder. Jessica had been set on fire, a horrific method of killing that indicated a high degree of violence and cruelty. The defense, on the other hand, sought to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. They argued that there were inconsistencies in the evidence, and that the prosecution had failed to prove Tellis' guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They claimed that the blood on Tellis' clothing could have been transferred in ways that did not involve him committing the murder. They also pointed out that Jessica's final words were not definitive enough to identify him as the killer. Furthermore, they argued that there were other possible suspects who had not been properly investigated. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the case would not be easy to resolve. The prosecution had presented a strong case, but the defense had raised enough questions about the evidence to make the jury doubt Tellis' guilt. The fact that there was no clear motive for the crime and the lack of direct proof made the case even more complicated. The jury would have to weigh the evidence carefully and determine whether it was enough to convict Tellis. For Jessica's family, the trial was an emotionally taxing experience. Lisa Chambers, in particular, struggled to come to terms with her daughter's death while facing the challenges of the legal process. She continued to advocate for justice, hoping that the truth would eventually come to light. The trial became not just a legal battle, but an emotional journey for her and the rest of Jessica's family, who had to endure the public scrutiny and the painful reminder of the brutal way in which they had lost their loved one. The investigation into the murder of Jessica Chambers took many twists and turns, and it soon became evident that finding conclusive evidence to link Quentin Tellis to the crime would not be easy. Despite the circumstantial evidence pointing toward Tellis, the case lacked a clear and undeniable motive. The authorities continued to examine every lead, but with each passing day, the mystery surrounding Jessica's death deepened. One of the major challenges the investigators faced was the lack of direct eyewitness testimony. While Jessica had managed to utter the name Eric in her final moments, no one could confirm who exactly this Eric was. Several individuals with the name Eric had been in Jessica's life, but none seemed to fit the profile of someone who would commit such a brutal act. Investigators found it especially frustrating that Jessica's final words were so vague, leaving them with little to work with as they tried to piece together the puzzle. Despite these obstacles, the authorities continued to focus on Quentin Tellis. Tellis had a criminal record, which made him a suspect in the eyes of law enforcement. He had a history of run-ins with the law, but none of his previous offenses were as serious as a murder. Nevertheless, the connection between Tellis and Jessica was undeniable. The two had spent time together before the murder, and there were reports that they had been in a brief romantic relationship. One of the significant pieces of evidence that the investigators discovered was the surveillance video from a local gas station. The footage showed Jessica and Tellis interacting in the hours leading up to her death. The video didn't show the actual crime, but it did confirm that Tellis and Jessica had been in close proximity shortly before she was found. The video also raised questions about the nature of their relationship and what had transpired between them. Along with the gas station video, the police obtained phone records that indicated Jessica and Tellis had been in contact on the night of her death. The calls and text messages exchanged between them were not enough to confirm the details of their interactions, but they did suggest that Tellis had been in communication with Jessica during the critical hours leading up to the attack. This, combined with the surveillance footage, was enough to make him a primary suspect, though it was still not enough to definitively prove that he had committed the crime. In addition to the phone records, forensic evidence played a major role in the investigation. Blood found on Tellis' clothing was identified as Jessica's. This was a critical piece of evidence, as it indicated that Tellis had been in close contact with Jessica at some point after the attack. The presence of her blood on his clothing strongly suggested that he had played a role in her death. However, Tellis denied any involvement, claiming that the blood had somehow ended up on his clothes without him being responsible for the crime. Despite his denials, the blood evidence was enough to secure an arrest. In February 2016, Quentin Tellis was charged with capital murder. The arrest brought a sense of relief to Jessica's family, who had been struggling with the uncertainty surrounding her death. But the legal process was just beginning, and many questions remained unanswered. The arrest of Tellis marked the beginning of a lengthy and complicated legal process. Tellis was initially held without bail as he awaited trial. Throughout the proceedings, his defense team argued that there was insufficient evidence to charge him with murder. They maintained that the circumstantial evidence was not enough to establish Tellis' guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They also pointed out that Jessica's final words, though significant, were far from conclusive and did not prove that Tellis had been the one who attacked her. As the trial approached, the public's interest in the case grew. The media, particularly in Mississippi, began to cover the story extensively, focusing on the shocking nature of the crime and the ensuing investigation. Jessica's family, especially her mother Lisa Chambers, became vocal advocates for justice, using the media to bring attention to her daughter's death and the need for the truth to be revealed. In addition to the legal proceedings, the trial brought to light some of the deeper, more uncomfortable issues surrounding the case. The question of race played a significant role, as Jessica Chambers was a young white woman and Quentin Tellis was a black man. Some observers speculated that racial dynamics could have played a part in how the case was perceived and how the investigation unfolded. The town of Cortland, where the crime occurred, was predominantly African American, and the case stirred discussions about race relations, law enforcement, and the treatment of suspects in the criminal justice system. Throughout the trial, both the prosecution and the defense presented their arguments. The prosecution focused on the blood evidence, the phone records, and the gas station video to argue that Tellis had been involved in the murder. They painted a picture of a calculated, premeditated attack, suggesting that Tellis had planned the crime in advance. The prosecution also emphasized the brutality of the murder. Jessica had been set on fire, a horrific method of killing that indicated a high degree of violence and cruelty. The defense, on the other hand, sought to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. They argued that there were inconsistencies in the evidence, and that the prosecution had failed to prove Tellis' guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They claimed that the blood on Tellis' clothing could have been transferred in ways that did not involve him committing the murder. They also pointed out that Jessica's final words were not definitive enough to identify him as the killer. Furthermore, they argued that there were other possible suspects who had not been properly investigated. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the case would not be easy to resolve. The prosecution had presented a strong case, but the defense had raised enough questions about the evidence to make the jury doubt Tellis' guilt. The fact that there was no clear motive for the crime and the lack of direct proof made the case even more complicated. The jury would have to weigh the evidence carefully and determine whether it was enough to convict Tellis. For Jessica's family, the trial was an emotionally taxing experience. Lisa Chambers, in particular, struggled to come to terms with her daughter's death while facing the challenges of the legal process. She continued to advocate for justice, hoping that the truth would eventually come to light. The trial became not just a legal battle, but an emotional journey for her and the rest of Jessica's family, who had to endure the public scrutiny and the painful reminder of the brutal way in which they had lost their loved one. The trial of Quentin Tellis finally began in early 2017, and it became one of the most widely covered cases in Mississippi that year. The courtroom was filled with reporters, family members, and members of the public who had been following the case since Jessica Chambers' tragic death in 2014. The pressure on both the prosecution and the defense was immense, as they prepared to present their cases to the jury, who would ultimately decide whether Quentin Tellis was guilty of Jessica's brutal murder. The prosecution's strategy was to emphasize the strong circumstantial evidence against Tellis. They presented the blood found on his clothes as a significant piece of evidence, linking him directly to Jessica's injuries. They also showcased phone records that demonstrated communication between Tellis and Jessica on the night of her death, suggesting that the two had been in contact in the hours leading up to the attack. The video footage from the gas station showing Tellis and Jessica together earlier that evening was another important piece of evidence. While this video did not show the crime itself, it established that the two had interacted shortly before her death, strengthening the prosecution's argument that Tellis had been involved. Additionally, the prosecution emphasized Jessica's final words, where she managed to identify a man named Eric. While it remained unclear if Tellis was the Eric she referred to, the prosecution argued that there was enough circumstantial evidence to suggest that he was likely the one responsible for the attack. The brutal nature of the crime, Jessica had been set on fire, further supported the prosecution's theory that the murder was premeditated and deliberate. The authorities believed that Tellis had orchestrated the crime, seeking revenge or a form of retribution for reasons that were still unclear. However, The defense team worked relentlessly to undermine the prosecution's case. They argued that the evidence was far from conclusive, and that there was not enough direct proof to link Tellis to the murder beyond a reasonable doubt. One of the central points in their defense was the vagueness of Jessica's final words. While she had mentioned the name Eric, the defense pointed out that this alone could not definitively identify Quentin Tellis as the killer. They questioned whether Jessica had accurately identified her attacker, given her severely burned state and the trauma she had experienced. The defense also challenged the forensic evidence, specifically the blood found on Tellis' clothing. They argued that there was no direct proof to show how the blood had been transferred to his clothing. The defense suggested that it was possible that the blood could have been from a different source, and they criticized the police for failing to rule out other potential explanations. Additionally, they attacked the reliability of the witnesses, including the testimony of Brooke O'Bannon, who had claimed to have seen Tellis near the scene of the crime. The defense contended that O'Bannon's recollection was flawed, and that her testimony could not be trusted as definitive evidence. Another point the defense raised was the lack of a clear motive for Tellis to kill Jessica. They argued that there was no obvious reason for him to commit such a violent and horrific act. They contended that the prosecution's theory of premeditated murder lacked substance, as there were no clear indications of animosity or conflict between Tellis and Jessica in the days leading up to the murder. This lack of motive was one of the main points of contention in the trial, as the defense sought to convince the jury that Tellis had no reason to kill Jessica. As the trial continued, both sides presented their arguments in an emotional and tense atmosphere. For Jessica's family, the pain of reliving the events surrounding her death was overwhelming. Her mother, Lisa Chambers, continued to speak out for justice, appearing in the media and maintaining her resolve to see her daughter's killer held accountable. The emotional toll on the family was immense, and the trial added to their grief, as they were forced to endure the details of Jessica's brutal death in a public courtroom. Finally, after several weeks of testimony, the jury began deliberating. The evidence was complex, and the case had raised numerous questions that made it difficult to reach a clear conclusion. While the prosecution had presented strong circumstantial evidence, there were enough uncertainties and gaps in the case for the defense to argue that Tellis should not be convicted. As the jury deliberated, there was a sense of anticipation as the community, Jessica's family, and those following the case anxiously awaited the outcome. After a tense deliberation period, the jury returned with a verdict. Quentin Tellis was found not guilty of capital murder. The decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond, leaving many stunned by the outcome. Jessica's family, particularly her mother, was devastated. For Lisa Chambers, the verdict was a heartbreaking blow, as she had spent years fighting for justice for her daughter. The case had taken a heavy toll on her family, and the not guilty verdict left them grappling with a sense of unfinished business and a deep sense of loss. Despite the not guilty verdict, the case continued to stir debate within the community and the broader public. Many believed that Tellis was responsible for Jessica's death, while others felt that the evidence presented was not sufficient to secure a conviction. The case raised important questions about the criminal justice system and the challenges of prosecuting violent crimes with limited evidence. For Jessica's family, the lack of closure meant that their fight for justice would continue, even as the legal system had given its final decision. In the aftermath of the trial, Jessica's murder remained an unsolved mystery in the eyes of many. The case highlighted the limitations of circumstantial evidence and the difficulty of obtaining a conviction when there are gaps in the story and conflicting witness testimonies. The pain of Jessica's death continued to resonate with her family, who were left without the answers they had been hoping for. The case also underscored the complexity of criminal investigations and trials, where justice is not always clear-cut and where the search for truth can take years, if not decades. As of now, the murder of Jessica Chambers remains one of the most notorious unsolved crimes in Mississippi's recent history. Despite the not guilty verdict, the case continues to haunt the community of Cortland and those who followed the investigation. For Jessica's family, the journey for justice remains ongoing, and the memory of her tragic death is a painful reminder of how sometimes, even when all seems clear, the pursuit of justice can be a long and uncertain road. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. In 2016, one of the most shocking criminal cases in the United States revolved around the brutal shooting death of 27-year-old Philando Castile in Falcon Heights, Minnesota. This case drew national attention due to the disturbing circumstances surrounding the incident, the actions of the police officers involved, and the widespread public outcry over police use of force. Castile's death would be added to the growing list of high-profile cases involving police officers shooting unarmed black individuals, sparking protests and discussions about racial inequality and police brutality across the nation. The events leading up to Philando Castile's death unfolded on July 6, 2016, when he was pulled over by Officer Geronimo Yanez, a member of the St. Anthony Police Department. Castile, a school cafeteria worker who was well-known and well-liked in his community, was driving with his girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, and her 4-year-old daughter in the car. They were stopped in a residential area in Falcon Heights, just outside of St. Paul, Minnesota, for a broken taillight. Castile, who had a valid permit to carry a firearm, informed Officer Yanez that he was carrying a gun. In a calm and composed manner, Castile told the officer, "Sir, I have to tell you, I do have a firearm on me." According to the video footage that Diamond Reynolds later captured on her phone, Castile informed the officer about the weapon before Yanez asked him for his license and registration. What happened next unfolded in front of the camera in a way that many people found deeply disturbing. As Castile reached for his identification, Officer Yanez, without any clear verbal warning, opened fire, shooting Castile multiple times at point-blank range. Reynolds, who was sitting next to Castile in the car, immediately began recording the aftermath of the shooting. The video, which went viral on social media, showed Castile slumped in his seat, blood flowing from his wounds, while Reynolds repeatedly told the officer, "You just killed my boyfriend." Throughout the video, the sound of Castile's gasps and Reynolds' frantic voice captured the horror of the moment. As soon as the shooting occurred, Reynolds was told to get out of the car and was handcuffed in front of her daughter. Meanwhile, Castile's injuries were severe, and he was rushed to the hospital. Sadly, he was pronounced dead shortly after the incident. The immediate aftermath of the shooting sent shockwaves through the community and the nation, with people demanding answers, accountability, and justice for Philando Castile. The video that Reynolds recorded played a critical role in the public's reaction to the shooting. It was raw and emotional, providing undeniable evidence of the immediate aftermath of the shooting, though it did not capture the moments leading up to the shooting. The video sparked outrage and calls for greater accountability within police departments, particularly when it came to the use of deadly force against unarmed individuals. For many, Castile's death was seen as yet another example of systemic racism and police violence against Black Americans. It was added to a growing list of cases involving police officers shooting and killing black men, such as those of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Tamir Rice. The Castile case stood out in part because of the clear evidence presented by the video. It forced the country to confront uncomfortable questions about the treatment of people of color by law enforcement. In the wake of the shooting, protesters gathered in Minneapolis and across the country, calling for justice for Philando Castile. The Black Lives Matter movement, which had been gaining momentum in recent years, amplified its efforts to bring attention to police brutality and racial injustice. Castile's death was added to the list of names of black individuals killed by police officers, and it became a rallying cry for activists who were demanding change in the way police interacted with minority communities. The following day, Officer Yanez was placed on administrative leave while the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, BCA, launched an investigation into the incident. As is customary in such cases, the BCA conducted an independent investigation to determine whether Yanez's actions were justified under the law. Yanez, who had been a police officer for 4 years, claimed that he shot Castile in self-defense, asserting that Castile had been reaching for his firearm. In a statement to investigators, Yanez said that he feared for his life after Castile reached toward his waistband, where his gun was located. He argued that the shooting was necessary to protect himself from a perceived threat. However, the video recorded by Reynolds told a different story. Many observers, including legal experts, questioned whether Yanez's response was proportional to the situation. In the video, Castile had already informed the officer that he was carrying a weapon and had not made any aggressive moves toward Yanez. Furthermore, there were conflicting reports about whether Castile was in the process of reaching for his gun at the time of the shooting. The investigation would take several months before a decision was made about whether Officer Yanez should face charges for the shooting. In the meantime, the Castile family, along with supporters and activists, continued to demand justice. The case was widely discussed in the media, and tensions between the police and the community continued to rise. Many believed that Yanez had acted recklessly, while others felt that he was justified in defending himself, based on his account of the situation. On March 16, 2017, after a thorough investigation, Yanez was charged with second-degree manslaughter and 2 counts of dangerous discharge of a firearm. The manslaughter charge carried a potential prison sentence of up to 10 years. The charges came as a result of the investigation, which found that Yanez had not followed proper police procedures when handling the situation, and that his actions were not reasonable in response to the threat that Castile posed. The decision to charge Yanez was hailed by some as a victory for justice, but it also sparked a great deal of debate. Many questioned whether the charge was strong enough, while others argued that the officer should have been charged with first-degree murder. The trial of Officer Yanez began in late May 2017. It was held in the same city where the shooting occurred, and it was closely watched by the public. Throughout the trial, the prosecution and defense presented their respective cases. The prosecution argued that Yanez had used excessive force and had failed to de-escalate the situation, while the defense contended that Yanez had acted in self-defense, fearing that Castile was reaching for a weapon. The case would ultimately come down to whether Yanez's actions could be deemed reasonable in the context of the situation, and whether the shooting was a result of his failure to follow proper procedure. As the trial of Officer Geronimo Yanez continued, both sides presented their arguments in an attempt to sway the jury's opinion. The prosecution focused heavily on the notion that Yanez had used unnecessary force in the situation, and that the events leading up to the shooting could have been handled differently. They argued that, based on the video footage from Diamond Reynolds' phone, there was no clear indication that Philando Castile posed a deadly threat when he was shot. Castile had told Yanez that he had a firearm, and he had attempted to comply with the officer's requests. One of the key points that the prosecution emphasized was the fact that Castile was already in the process of complying with Yanez's instructions when he was shot. According to Reynolds' testimony, Castile had reached for his identification, not his gun, when he was fired upon. In the video, Reynolds could be heard pleading with the officer to let Castile live and to stop shooting. This added to the argument that Yanez had acted rashly without properly assessing the situation. The prosecution contended that, even if Castile had been reaching for his firearm, the officer had a duty to carefully evaluate the threat level and consider whether there were other options to de-escalate the situation. Furthermore, the prosecution introduced expert testimony from law enforcement officials, who testified that Yanez had not followed the proper protocol for dealing with a person who had a gun. These experts stated that Yanez should have communicated with Castile more clearly and assessed the situation more carefully before resorting to deadly force. According to these experts, Castile's actions, informing the officer about the firearm, should have triggered a more cautious approach from Yanez, instead of an immediate decision to shoot. The defense, on the other hand, argued that Officer Yanez was acting in self-defense. They maintained that when Castile reached for his waistband, Yanez feared that he was going to pull out a weapon, and that he was forced to act quickly to protect his life. The defense team claimed that Yanez had every reason to believe that Castile was a threat, particularly given the circumstances of the stop, which involved a possible weapon. They also pointed to the high-stress nature of police work, suggesting that officers often have to make split-second decisions that are difficult to fully judge from the outside. The defense also argued that the officer's actions were not motivated by racial bias, but rather by a genuine fear for his life. They pointed out that Yanez had no prior history of misconduct or racial bias, and that the decision to use force was based on the belief that he was in immediate danger. Additionally, they claimed that the shooting could have been avoided if Castile had complied with the officer's instructions more promptly and without hesitation. The trial also included testimony from a number of police experts, who testified that Yanez's decision to open fire was consistent with how officers are trained to handle situations in which they believe they are in danger. The defense emphasized the training that officers receive on how to deal with potential threats, including the use of deadly force when necessary. They argued that, given the information Yanez had at the time, Castile's admission that he had a gun, the officer's actions could be seen as a justified attempt to protect himself from what he perceived as a potential threat. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence presented by the defense was the testimony of Officer Yanez himself. He explained that when he stopped Castile, he initially saw the driver's hands on the wheel, but when he asked for identification, Castile began reaching into his pocket, which made the officer nervous. Yanez said he saw Castile's right hand move toward his waistband, and he feared that Castile might be drawing the firearm. According to Yanez, he felt it was necessary to shoot Castile because of the perceived danger. Yanez's defense was centered around the idea that police officers should be given the benefit of the doubt when they make split-second decisions under pressure. The defense contended that it was easy for the public and the jury to judge the situation from a distance, but it was far more difficult for an officer to make a decision in the heat of the moment, especially when faced with the possibility of armed resistance. They emphasized that Yanez had no choice but to react as he did, given the potential threat that Castile posed. The prosecution, however, argued that Yanez had failed to de-escalate the situation and had made a hasty decision to use deadly force when it was not warranted. The prosecution's case was further bolstered by the body camera footage from Officer Yanez's partner, who had been present at the scene during the shooting. Although the footage was not as clear as the video recorded by Reynolds, it provided additional context about the moment leading up to the shooting. The prosecution argued that the footage showed no signs of immediate danger and that Yanez should have waited before pulling the trigger. Throughout the trial, emotions ran high as the case raised important questions about race, police violence, and the use of force. The Castile family and their supporters were adamant that Yanez's actions were unjustified, while those in support of the officer believed that he acted in a manner consistent with his training. The trial itself was a reflection of the deep divisions in the country over issues of policing, race, and accountability. As the days passed, it became clear that the verdict would be a defining moment not only for the Castile family, but for the larger conversation about police brutality and its consequences in the United States. As the trial progressed, the jury was tasked with determining whether Yanez's actions were reasonable under the circumstances, or whether they constituted reckless behavior. After deliberating for several days, the jury returned its verdict on June 16, 2017. Officer Geronimo Yanez was acquitted of all charges, including second-degree manslaughter. The verdict sparked an immediate outcry, as many people believed that Yanez should have been held accountable for Castile's death. Protests erupted in the streets of Minneapolis and other cities across the country, with demonstrators voicing their anger and frustration over what they saw as another case of police officers being allowed to act with impunity. The decision to acquit Yanez was a stark reminder of the ongoing challenges in addressing police violence, particularly against Black Americans. Despite the emotional testimony, the video footage, and the public outcry, the jury found that the prosecution had not proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The ruling highlighted the complexities and uncertainties of policing in the United States, and it raised further questions about how to ensure accountability in cases involving police use of force. The acquittal of Officer Geronimo Yanez in the shooting death of Philando Castile led to widespread disappointment and anger among activists, the Castile family, and many others who had followed the case closely. For those who had hoped for justice and accountability, the verdict was seen as a painful reminder of the ongoing struggle for police reform and racial equality in the United States. The case continued to spark debates on whether police officers were held to the same standards as ordinary citizens when it came to the use of deadly force. In the aftermath of the trial, the Castile family expressed their heartbreak and disbelief. Castile's mother, Valerie Castile, was outspoken in her grief, calling the verdict a failure of the justice system. She and other family members had hoped that the trial would result in a conviction that would send a message to law enforcement about the need for change. However, the jury's decision left them feeling that the system had let them down. Valerie Castile, along with her supporters, continued to call for changes in the way police interact with Black communities and the way the justice system handles cases involving police. The case also led to further conversations about the need for police reform and accountability. The Black Lives Matter movement, which had already been advocating for reforms to address police violence, gained additional momentum following the verdict. Many activists used Castile's case as an example of why systemic change was necessary to reduce police violence and ensure that law enforcement officers were held accountable for their actions. The case was part of a broader conversation about the disproportionate use of force against Black people in the United States and the racial disparities that persisted within the criminal justice system. While the legal process had concluded, the emotional toll on the community and the Castile family continued. The video that Diamond Reynolds recorded was widely circulated, and it became a symbol of the painful reality faced by many Black individuals and families in the United States. The video, which captured the immediate aftermath of the shooting, was a powerful and chilling reminder of the vulnerability that black people often feel when interacting with law enforcement. It also highlighted the importance of holding police officers accountable for their actions, as well as the need for greater transparency in police interactions. In addition to the calls for police reform, the case also raised questions about the role of race in policing. Castile's death was seen by many as an example of the dangers black people face when interacting with police officers, even when they are complying with the law. The fact that Castile was carrying a firearm legally and had informed the officer about it in advance did not seem to prevent the officer from opening fire. This led many to question whether the response would have been the same had Castile been white, raising uncomfortable questions about racial bias and the treatment of people of color by law enforcement. Philando Castile's death also had a lasting impact on the community where he lived and worked. He was a beloved member of the community, known for his calm demeanor and his role as a cafeteria worker at an elementary school. Castile's colleagues, friends, and students were devastated by his death, and his memory became a rallying point for those who sought justice for him and for all those who had suffered similar fates. In the wake of the shooting, the community of Falcon Heights and the larger Minneapolis-St. Paul area came together to support the Castile family and to call for change in the police force. In the years following the trial, the conversation surrounding Castile's death and the broader issues of police violence and racial inequality continued to evolve. The case was discussed in classrooms, at protests, and in communities across the country. It was frequently referenced as a pivotal moment in the national conversation on police reform, illustrating the deep divisions in how police violence was perceived and how it should be addressed. Philando Castile's death became a symbol of the urgent need for reform and greater accountability in law enforcement. His legacy was carried forward by those who continued to fight for justice and by the movement for racial equality. Though the legal system did not provide the closure that many had hoped for, the case continued to inspire those who believed in a fairer and more just society, where individuals were not subjected to violence simply because of their race. In the years following the acquittal, the demand for changes in police training, transparency, and accountability only grew. Philando Castile's case, alongside other high-profile cases, showed that there was a long way to go in ensuring that law enforcement in the United States treated all citizens fairly and equitably, regardless of race. The tragedy of Castile's death was a reminder of the ongoing challenges facing communities of color and the need for continued efforts to create a justice system that truly works for everyone. Ultimately, while the legal battle was over, the fight for justice in the case of Philando Castile and others like him continued. His story would never be forgotten, and his memory would live on as a call for change, urging people to stand up against injustice and to push for a future where all individuals, regardless of race, are treated with dignity and respect. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. In 2016, a tragic event occurred in the city of Orlando, Florida, which would soon become one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history. This incident is widely known as the Pulse nightclub shooting, and it shook the entire nation, sparking debates about gun control, terrorism, hate crimes, and the safety of marginalized communities. On the night of June 12, 2016, at approximately 2 a.m., the Pulse nightclub, a popular gay bar in Orlando, was bustling with activity. The club was hosting Latin Night, an event aimed at celebrating Latinx culture within the LGBTQ+ community. The club, located in the heart of Orlando, was filled with hundreds of people enjoying music, dancing, and socializing. The scene inside was full of energy, with people living their lives freely without fear. But that peaceful environment was about to be shattered by an act of violence that would leave 49 people dead and 53 more injured. The shooter, later identified as 29-year-old Omar Mateen, entered the nightclub armed with an assault rifle and a handgun. Mateen, a security guard by profession, had been preparing for this moment for several weeks. He began his attack by firing into the crowd at random. Chaos erupted as people screamed and scrambled for safety. Mateen was able to enter the club, where he continued his assault, taking hostages and creating a terrifying scene of panic. He reportedly exchanged gunfire with police officers who arrived at the scene, but he managed to hold many people inside the club hostage. Mateen's actions were deliberate. As he moved throughout the nightclub, he contacted police and even declared allegiance to terrorist groups. During his 911 calls, Mateen mentioned the name of the leader of the terrorist group ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, suggesting that his actions were politically motivated and that he was attempting to carry out an act of terrorism. The FBI, which had previously investigated Mateen for alleged ties to radical groups, later confirmed that he had been on their radar. However, no concrete evidence of criminal activity or terrorist affiliations had been found in the years leading up to the attack. Mateen's attack lasted for several hours, with law enforcement officers surrounding the building and attempting to negotiate with him. The police tried to create an escape route for those inside, but the situation became increasingly tense as the minutes passed. As more officers arrived on the scene, they attempted to breach the club and end the standoff. At one point, an armored vehicle was used to break through the wall of the nightclub, and officers rushed in. This decision was made after Mateen began threatening to kill the hostages he had inside. The final moments of the attack were chaotic and heart-wrenching. Mateen was confronted by law enforcement officers and engaged in a firefight with them. In the end, he was killed by police in a shootout. By the time the shooting was over, 49 people had lost their lives, and dozens more were seriously injured. Many of the survivors were left traumatized by the violence they had witnessed, and many had to endure the emotional and psychological scars from the horrific event. The attack at Pulse nightclub was one of the deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history at the time. It not only devastated the LGBTQ+ community, but also raised serious questions about the safety of public spaces and the role of gun control laws. The shooter, Omar Mateen, had legally purchased the weapons used in the attack, which led to renewed calls for more stringent gun control measures in the United States. Many felt that the government had failed to prevent such tragedies due to the lack of significant gun control legislation. In the wake of the shooting, the nation was left in mourning. The LGBTQ+ community, already dealing with the struggles of discrimination, hate, and violence, was once again confronted with the reality of being targeted for who they were. The attack was deemed an act of homophobic violence by many, and LGBTQ+ advocacy groups quickly mobilized to call attention to the increasing threats facing the community. Additionally, the intersection of gun violence and terrorism was brought to the forefront of public discussion. In response to the massacre, both local and national politicians issued statements expressing their condolences to the victims and their families. President Barack Obama, at the time, called the event an act of terror and an act of hate. The shooting also prompted mass vigils, protests, and demonstrations across the country, with people from all walks of life showing support for the victims and standing in solidarity with the LGBTQ+ community. In the aftermath of the Pulse nightclub shooting, the conversation surrounding gun violence and gun control laws in the U.S. reached new heights. While the massacre was not the first mass shooting in American history, it stood out due to its horrific scale and the fact that it targeted a vulnerable and often marginalized group of people. Calls for increased regulation on firearms, background checks, and restrictions on assault rifles were reignited. Many also called for measures that would address the growing issue of mental health care in the country and the role it might play in preventing future tragedies. The emotional toll of the attack was immense for the families of the victims, as well as for those who survived. The survivors of the Pulse nightclub shooting found themselves grappling with both physical and psychological injuries. Some of the survivors suffered life-threatening wounds, while others faced mental health challenges in the wake of the trauma. Many sought therapy and counseling to cope with the impact of the attack. The emotional pain endured by the families of the victims was indescribable, as they lost their loved ones in an attack that was both senseless and fueled by hate. In the months and years following the shooting, the city of Orlando and the country as a whole worked toward healing. Memorials were held, both public and private, to remember those who had been lost and to support those who had survived. The tragedy also prompted a larger conversation about the rights of LGBTQ+ individuals, especially regarding the safety of LGBTQ+ spaces. The Pulse shooting would ultimately serve as a reminder of the need for more inclusive and supportive communities, where people could live freely without fear of violence or discrimination. Despite the heavy toll of the attack, the survivors of Pulse nightclub demonstrated incredible strength and resilience. Many became vocal advocates for gun reform, LGBTQ+ rights, and social justice. The tragedy of June 12, 2016, became a rallying cry for those who sought to change the systems that allowed such violence to occur, and it spurred renewed efforts to ensure that future generations would not face the same threats. The Pulse nightclub shooting also had a profound impact on U.S. national security and counterterrorism efforts. While the attack was classified as both a terrorist act and a hate crime, it highlighted the challenge of identifying and preventing domestic terrorism before it manifests into violence. The case led to further scrutiny of the U.S. government's approach to combating extremism and terrorism, particularly as it relates to lone wolf attackers who may not be part of a larger organization. The Pulse massacre remains a tragic reminder of the dangers of hate, intolerance, and violence in American society. It sparked a crucial national conversation about gun violence, discrimination, and the safety of marginalized communities, particularly the LGBTQ+ community. Even though the event itself was horrific, it also ignited a sense of solidarity and resilience among those who vowed to fight for justice and equality for all individuals, regardless of their sexual orientation, identity, or background. In the aftermath of the Pulse nightclub shooting, the city of Orlando and the United States as a whole were left grappling with the devastating consequences of what had happened. The tragedy not only shocked the nation but also left a deep, lasting scar on the LGBTQ+ community. Pulse was more than just a nightclub. It was a safe space for LGBTQ+ individuals, where they could be themselves without fear of judgment or discrimination. For many, it was a sanctuary, a place to express their identities freely. The brutal attack disrupted this haven, and the survivors of the attack were now left to rebuild their lives in a world that had changed forever. In the days following the massacre, the community came together in profound ways. Vigils were held, not just in Orlando but around the country and the world, as people expressed solidarity with the victims and their families. One of the most poignant moments came when thousands gathered for a candlelight vigil in downtown Orlando. The vigil was a moment of collective grief, as well as a powerful display of unity against the hate that had driven the attack. People from all walks of life, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, came together to mourn the victims and to vow that such a senseless act would not define the LGBTQ+ community or their right to live freely and openly. The Pulse shooting, while deeply personal for the LGBTQ+ community, also marked a watershed moment for the country in terms of its approach to gun violence. For years, there had been calls for stricter gun control laws, especially after mass shootings in places like Sandy Hook, Virginia Tech, and Charleston. The Pulse nightclub shooting brought these calls to the forefront once again. However, despite the public outcry and the emotional weight of the tragedy, little progress was made at the federal level in terms of meaningful gun legislation. Instead, the issue remained polarized, with many Republicans and gun rights advocates arguing against any kind of additional restrictions on firearms. Yet, in some states and cities, the Pulse shooting served as a catalyst for change. For example, in Florida, local leaders and gun control advocates began pushing for stronger background checks and limitations on assault rifles. Even though Florida has historically been a pro-gun state, the Pulse attack led to renewed conversations about how to balance Second Amendment rights with the need for public safety. Still, national action remained elusive. The lack of legislative progress became a source of frustration for many, as it seemed that political gridlock, combined with the influence of powerful lobbying groups like the National Rifle Association, NRA, prevented any substantial reform. The mass shooting also drew attention to the challenges of addressing terrorism on U.S. soil. While Mateen's ties to extremist groups were a significant aspect of the investigation, many were left wondering whether the attack could have been prevented. The FBI had investigated Mateen previously for suspected ties to radical groups, but the investigation had been closed due to a lack of evidence. In the weeks following the attack, questions arose about the adequacy of the FBI's response and whether more could have been done to prevent Mateen from carrying out the attack. His status as a lone wolf terrorist, who was radicalized without any direct connection to a foreign terrorist organization, presented new challenges for counterterrorism efforts in the U.S. Although Mateen had claimed allegiance to ISIS during the attack, there was no definitive evidence that he was working directly with the terrorist organization. However, his actions were framed by many as an attempt to further the goals of extremist groups, especially in light of the rising tide of anti-LGBTQ+ violence worldwide. This blending of domestic terrorism, hate crime, and mental health issues made the Pulse shooting a particularly complex and troubling event. Law enforcement agencies and experts in counterterrorism and extremism scrambled to understand Mateen's motivations and his path to violence. Some speculated that Mateen may have been attempting to gain notoriety, while others pointed to deeper issues of homophobia, mental health, and radicalization. The shooting also reignited conversations about the role of social media in radicalization and violence. Prior to the attack, Mateen had posted on Facebook and other platforms, often expressing extreme views. Some argued that better regulation of social media platforms could help prevent such attacks by identifying and monitoring dangerous behavior online. Others pointed out that the issue was not one of censorship, but rather about improving the monitoring and intelligence sharing efforts between social media companies, law enforcement, and intelligence agencies. At the same time, many LGBTQ+ advocates and allies saw the Pulse nightclub shooting as a reminder of the deep-seated homophobia and violence that the community still faces. The attack was not just an act of terrorism, but also an assault on the LGBTQ+ community's right to exist safely in public spaces. LGBTQ+ advocates pointed out that hate crimes targeting their community had been on the rise for years, and the Pulse shooting served as a tragic example of the extreme violence that could result from such hatred. The event led to increased calls for the U.S. government to address hate crimes more aggressively and for stronger protections for LGBTQ+ individuals at both the state and federal levels. In the years since the shooting, Orlando has worked hard to heal and rebuild, while the victims' families and survivors have done their part to honor those who were lost. The city itself created several memorials, including the Pulse Memorial, which stands as a tribute to the lives lost and the resilience of the LGBTQ+ community. The memorial became a place for people to pay their respects and to reflect on the lasting impact of the tragedy. Local businesses, churches, and community organizations also came together to support the victims and their families, providing emotional support, counseling, and financial assistance. The shooting also inspired a new generation of LGBTQ+ activists who worked tirelessly to promote awareness and demand justice. Many of the survivors went on to become vocal advocates for stricter gun control laws and for increased protection of LGBTQ+ rights. The legacy of Pulse has become one of resilience, activism, and a call for change. The tragic event underscored the urgent need to address both the rising tide of violence targeting LGBTQ+ people and the widespread availability of firearms in the United States. On a national level, the Pulse nightclub shooting reinforced the stark reality that the fight for equality and safety is ongoing. The LGBTQ+ community and its allies were left to mourn and honor the victims while continuing to fight for their rights and dignity. The attack brought to light the challenges of combating both hate and terrorism in an increasingly polarized society. It served as a painful reminder of the work that remains to be done in ensuring that all individuals, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, or background, can live their lives without fear of violence. The tragic events of June 12, 2016, left an indelible mark on the city of Orlando, the United States, and the world. In the wake of the shooting, the community came together to mourn, support the victims' families, and demand change. The massacre at Pulse nightclub became a pivotal moment in the ongoing struggle for LGBTQ+ rights, safety, and equality, as well as a turning point in the national conversation about gun violence, terrorism, and hate crimes. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, numerous individuals and organizations stepped up to provide aid to the survivors and families of the victims. The city of Orlando, local businesses, and national organizations worked together to offer financial assistance, counseling, and other forms of support. For many, the tragedy at Pulse was not only a personal loss, but a collective wound that required a community-wide response to heal. The coming together of people from diverse backgrounds, LGBTQ+ individuals, allies, faith communities, and others, demonstrated the strength of unity in the face of unspeakable loss. The Pulse nightclub shooting also brought the issue of LGBTQ+ rights to the forefront of national and international discourse. For many members of the LGBTQ+ community, the attack symbolized the deep-seated hate and intolerance that continues to threaten their safety and well-being. It served as a stark reminder that, despite significant progress in securing equal rights for LGBTQ+ individuals, such as the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015, there was still much work to be done in ensuring the safety of LGBTQ+ people, particularly people of color, transgender individuals, and those living in less progressive areas. The events at Pulse illuminated how vulnerable the community remains to hate-fueled violence, discrimination, and marginalization. While the attack targeted LGBTQ+ people, it also spurred a broader movement to address issues of gun control. In the wake of the tragedy, many called for more stringent gun laws, including restrictions on the sale of assault rifles like the one used by Mateen in the attack. There were widespread demands for universal background checks and better screening for gun purchasers to prevent individuals with violent histories or extremist views from obtaining firearms. For many, the fact that Mateen was able to legally purchase weapons despite his history of suspected ties to extremist groups was an example of the flaws in the existing gun control system. However, as had been the case after previous mass shootings, legislative change at the national level proved difficult. Efforts to pass stronger gun control measures faced fierce opposition from political leaders and powerful lobbying groups, most notably the National Rifle Association, NRA, which argued that additional restrictions would infringe on Americans' Second Amendment rights. Despite widespread public support for reform, Congress failed to pass any significant legislation that would have addressed the issues raised by the Pulse shooting. This failure to enact meaningful gun reform left many frustrated and disillusioned, with critics arguing that the political system had once again failed to protect the public from violence. Nevertheless, there were some legislative victories at the state and local levels. In Florida, some lawmakers pushed for tighter restrictions on firearms, particularly regarding the sale of military-style assault rifles. The state of California also moved to tighten its gun laws in the wake of the attack, including efforts to expand background checks and restrict access to high-capacity magazines. While these efforts were met with varying degrees of success, they represented a growing recognition of the need for change in the way firearms are regulated in the United States. The Pulse nightclub shooting also raised questions about the role of mental health in preventing mass violence. While Mateen had no known history of mental illness, many observers speculated that his actions could have been influenced by deeper psychological issues, including his reported struggles with his identity and his history of violent behavior. Some called for better access to mental health care, both as a preventive measure to address potential threats and as a means of helping individuals who may be struggling with their emotions and well-being before they turn to violence. Critics argued that the nation's mental health care system was inadequate and that more needed to be done to support individuals who may be at risk of harm to themselves or others. The tragedy also led to increased discussions about the intersection of terrorism, domestic extremism, and hate crimes. Mateen's claim of allegiance to ISIS during the attack prompted officials to consider the ways in which domestic terrorism might manifest in the U.S. While Mateen's links to international terrorism were unclear, his actions were viewed by many as an example of a lone wolf terrorist who, while not directly affiliated with a foreign group, was influenced by extremist ideologies. This raised concerns about the growing threat posed by homegrown extremists and the difficulty in identifying and preventing such attacks before they occur. The victims and survivors of the Pulse shooting carried their own unique emotional burdens. For the families of those who died, the pain of loss was compounded by the senselessness of the act. Many of the victims were young people, full of promise and potential, whose lives were cut short by an individual motivated by hate. The survivors, on the other hand, faced both physical and emotional trauma, many of whom were left with lasting physical injuries and deep psychological scars. The emotional toll of the attack would reverberate through the community for years to come. In the years that followed, many of the survivors became vocal advocates for change. They shared their stories to raise awareness about the impact of gun violence, the importance of LGBTQ+ rights, and the need for action to address hate crimes. The Pulse massacre became a rallying point for a renewed focus on LGBTQ+ equality, and it galvanized a new generation of activists determined to fight for a safer, more inclusive society. The victims and their families were not forgotten. Their memories lived on in the hearts and minds of those who sought to ensure that such an event would never happen again. The Pulse nightclub shooting was a tragedy that exposed many of the fractures in American society, from the pervasive culture of gun violence to the ongoing threat of hate crimes against marginalized communities. But it was also a moment that sparked unity, resilience, and a commitment to change. As the LGBTQ+ community and its allies continued to push for justice and equality, the world witnessed an outpouring of love, support, and solidarity. The memory of those lost at Pulse served as a constant reminder that the fight for a more just and peaceful world must continue. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. One of the most shocking and tragic events in 2017 occurred in Las Vegas, Nevada, when a gunman opened fire on a crowd at the Route 91 Harvest Festival, a country music concert. The shooting, which took place on the night of October 1st, 2017, became the deadliest mass shooting in American history at the time. The shooter, later identified as 64-year-old Stephen Paddock, killed 58 people and wounded over 850 others before taking his own life. This horrifying incident would forever change the way people thought about safety at public events and raise significant questions about gun control in the United States. The Route 91 Harvest Festival was held on the grounds of the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino, a popular hotel and casino located on the Las Vegas Strip. The three-day festival was one of the largest country music events in the country, with thousands of fans attending to see performances by popular artists. On that fateful Sunday evening, Jason Aldean, a well-known country singer, was performing on stage when the attack began. The concert-goers were enjoying the music when, at approximately 10:05 p.m., a barrage of gunfire rang out from the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Hotel. Paddock had carefully planned the attack, bringing an arsenal of weapons into his hotel room and setting up several high-powered rifles on tripods, with scopes aimed at the concert crowd below. Paddock began shooting from his vantage point on the hotel's balcony. The concert-goers initially mistook the gunshots for fireworks or sound effects part of the show. However, it soon became clear that something much more dangerous was happening. Chaos erupted as people realized they were under attack. Attendees scrambled to take cover, some diving to the ground, others running in all directions, desperately trying to escape the deadly onslaught. Panic set in as the gunfire continued for over 10 minutes, sending people into a state of terror. The police, who were quickly alerted to the situation, responded with urgency. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department received numerous 911 calls from terrified concert-goers, some of whom were already injured. The police raced to the Mandalay Bay Hotel, where they immediately focused on locating the shooter's position. The authorities soon determined that the shots were coming from the hotel, and they began to formulate a plan to neutralize the threat. Meanwhile, the gunfire continued, and more people were struck by the bullets. The sheer volume and speed of the shooting made it incredibly difficult for law enforcement to assess the situation accurately. As the shooting continued, Paddock remained in his hotel room, firing hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He had placed several rifles in his room, equipped with bump stocks, a device that allows semi-automatic rifles to fire at a faster rate, mimicking automatic gunfire. This allowed him to unleash a relentless barrage of bullets on the crowd below. The intensity of the attack left a terrifying mark on the witnesses. The sheer randomness of the violence created an overwhelming sense of dread, as people realized that they were not just in danger of being shot, but were unable to escape the line of fire. The police quickly identified the location of the shooter, but they faced significant challenges in trying to reach him. Paddock had meticulously planned his attack, setting up multiple cameras in the hallway of the hotel room to monitor law enforcement's movements. This further delayed the police's response, as they had to take extra precautions to avoid being ambushed. Despite these efforts, the police finally made their way to Paddock's hotel room, and they breached the door to find that he had already died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was alone in the room, and there was no indication that anyone else had been involved in the attack. The aftermath of the shooting was both immediate and profound. First responders and medical personnel quickly began to treat the wounded, many of whom were rushed to local hospitals in critical condition. The hospitals in the Las Vegas area were overwhelmed, with staff working tirelessly to care for the injured. It was a chaotic scene, with some patients arriving at the emergency room in ambulances, while others were brought in by private vehicles. Volunteers and medical professionals from around the region came together to provide support, but the scale of the tragedy was staggering. The tragedy had far-reaching effects. The attack not only left 58 people dead and hundreds more injured, but it also left families, friends, and communities devastated by the loss of loved ones. The victims of the shooting were a mix of people from all walks of life, from concert-goers on vacation to locals who had come out for the night to enjoy the music. Some victims were young, others were older, and many were from other parts of the country. The massacre disrupted their lives in an instant, and the emotional toll on the families and loved ones of the victims was immense. In the days following the attack, there were a series of public statements from law enforcement and political leaders. The Las Vegas police, FBI, and other agencies immediately launched an investigation into the shooter's background and motivations. The investigation revealed that Paddock had no criminal record and appeared to have no direct political or ideological ties to any extremist groups. He had legally purchased the firearms used in the attack, including the high-powered rifles that allowed him to kill and injure so many people. Despite the lack of a clear motive, it became evident that Paddock had spent months preparing for the attack, acquiring firearms and ammunition in large quantities and making meticulous plans to carry out the massacre. One of the most perplexing aspects of the shooting was that there appeared to be no obvious warning signs or red flags that would have alerted authorities to Paddock's intentions. He had no known history of mental illness or extremist views, and he had no prior history of violent crime. While he had been investigated in the past for a minor issue involving a potential fraud case, there was no indication that he posed any kind of threat to the public. His behavior in the months leading up to the shooting was seemingly normal, making it incredibly difficult for authorities to predict that he was capable of carrying out such a horrific act. As the investigation continued, law enforcement officials began to analyze Paddock's personal history and his actions leading up to the attack. They discovered that he had visited Las Vegas multiple times prior to the shooting, staying at different hotels and scoping out potential locations for the attack. He had also researched previous mass shootings, which led investigators to speculate that he may have been inspired by other high-profile attacks. However, they found no clear evidence that he was motivated by any particular political or ideological stance, and many were left to wonder why he chose to carry out such a senseless act of violence. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement uncovered more details about Stephen Paddock's life and actions leading up to the attack. Paddock had been a private individual with a relatively quiet lifestyle. He had a history of gambling, and it was discovered that he had significant financial debts. Some speculated that his gambling losses may have played a role in his decision to carry out the attack, though no definitive link between his financial troubles and the shooting was ever established. The complexity of his motives and the lack of any clear ideological or personal grievance made it difficult to understand why Paddock decided to commit such a heinous act. Further investigation revealed that Paddock had purchased over 30 firearms, including semi-automatic rifles, shotguns, and handguns, in the months leading up to the shooting. Many of these firearms were obtained legally through federal firearms dealers. He also bought large quantities of ammunition, which he kept in his hotel room, as well as in his home in Mesquite, Nevada. In addition to his firearms, Paddock had equipped several of his rifles with bump stocks, which allowed the weapons to fire at an accelerated rate, similar to fully automatic firearms. This modification made the shooting more deadly, as Paddock could fire rounds more rapidly, striking more people in a shorter period. Bump stocks had become a point of controversy after the shooting. These devices, which can be attached to semi-automatic rifles, were initially designed to help people with disabilities better control their firearms. However, after the Las Vegas massacre, it became clear that bump stocks had been used to create a deadly weapon capable of inflicting mass casualties. Critics of the gun industry argued that the availability of such modifications allowed individuals, like Paddock, to convert semi-automatic rifles into weapons of war. The incident led to calls for greater regulation of firearms and their accessories, specifically to ban bump stocks and other modifications that could make firearms more lethal. In the aftermath of the shooting, lawmakers and gun control advocates pushed for stricter regulations on firearms. Some state governments began to introduce bills to regulate or ban bump stocks, while others called for stronger background checks, limitations on assault rifles, and restrictions on the sale of high-capacity magazines. However, despite the public outcry, efforts to pass comprehensive gun control laws at the federal level stalled. The National Rifle Association, NRA, and other gun rights groups strongly opposed these measures, arguing that the right to bear arms should not be infringed upon. As a result, while some progress was made on the state level, national gun control legislation remained elusive, and the debate over gun rights versus gun control continued to be highly polarized. The shooting also raised significant concerns about the safety of large public events. Prior to the attack, security at concerts and festivals was relatively lax, with only minimal checks for weapons or other dangerous items. After the massacre, many event organizers, especially those hosting large gatherings, began to reevaluate their security protocols. In the months following the shooting, some concert venues and festivals introduced more stringent security measures, including increased bag checks, metal detectors, and armed security personnel. While these measures were aimed at preventing future tragedies, They also raised questions about the balance between security and individual freedom. For many, the Las Vegas shooting marked a turning point in how public events would be handled in the future. The impact of the attack went far beyond the physical injuries sustained by the victims. Many of the survivors were left with severe emotional and psychological scars. PTSD, anxiety, and depression were common among those who had been at the concert. Several survivors reported experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, and heightened levels of fear in the days and months following the shooting. For some, even the sound of fireworks or loud noises could trigger intense anxiety, causing them to relive the trauma. Support groups and counseling services were offered to help the survivors cope with the aftermath, but for many, the road to recovery was long and difficult. In addition to the survivors, the families of the victims were left to deal with an overwhelming sense of grief and loss. Many of the victims were young people, some still in their teens or early 20s, who had their entire lives ahead of them. The senselessness of the attack made it all the more difficult for the families to come to terms with their loss. The victims came from all across the United States, with many traveling to Las Vegas to enjoy the music and the excitement of the festival. For some families, the attack not only robbed them of loved ones, but also left them grappling with the difficult task of finding answers. Despite the extensive investigation, there were still many unanswered questions about why Paddock committed the massacre and whether it could have been prevented. The city of Las Vegas itself was forever changed by the shooting. In the days following the attack, residents, local businesses, and organizations came together to support the victims and their families. Vigils were held, and thousands of people showed up to express their solidarity with the victims and to honor those who had lost their lives. The city's sense of community and resilience became a beacon of hope in the face of tragedy. The shooting was a reminder of the vulnerability that exists in public spaces, but it also underscored the strength of the human spirit and the ability to heal after unimaginable loss. In the months that followed, survivors and victims' families began to advocate for changes in gun laws and greater protection for public events. Some became vocal advocates for stricter regulations on firearms, while others pushed for mental health initiatives to better identify and address issues related to violence. The tragedy at the Route 91 Harvest Festival sparked debates about how to prevent similar attacks in the future, and whether the United States was doing enough to protect its citizens from the threat of mass shootings. The Las Vegas shooting was not an isolated event, but part of a larger, ongoing problem with gun violence in America. Despite the public outcry, the complex issues surrounding gun control, mental health, and terrorism remained contentious and unresolved. In the years following the Las Vegas massacre, the attack remained a haunting memory for the victims, their families, and the survivors. The tragedy left a lasting imprint on the city and the nation, and it sparked a series of important conversations about the safety of public spaces, gun laws, and the need for better preparedness in the face of such attacks. Despite the initial shock and grief, many of the survivors' and victims' families found ways to honor the memory of those who were lost. Memorials were established, and in Las Vegas, a permanent tribute to the victims was created. The 1 October Memorial, named after the date of the shooting, was unveiled in 2019 at the Las Vegas Village, the site of the massacre. The memorial consists of 58 pillars of varying heights, each representing one of the victims who died that night. The monument serves as a place for reflection and remembrance, allowing people to come together and honor the lives that were lost while also providing a space for survivors to share their experiences. The shooting also led to increased advocacy for changes in public policy. Survivors of the attack, as well as family members of the victims, became vocal proponents of stricter gun control measures. Some survivors testified before Congress, calling for an end to the sale of bump stocks, high-capacity magazines, and assault-style rifles, which they argued were designed to inflict mass casualties in a short period. In 2018, following pressure from advocates and the public, the federal government banned bump stocks through a regulation issued by the Department of Justice. However, despite this victory, advocates for gun control remained disappointed by the lack of broader reforms, such as universal background checks, the closing of loopholes in gun sales, and more stringent regulations on semi-automatic weapons. The conversation surrounding gun control in the United States remained deeply divisive. Gun rights advocates continued to argue that stricter regulations would infringe upon Americans' constitutional rights, while gun control proponents maintained that stronger laws were necessary to prevent further mass shootings. Public opinion was split, with surveys indicating that a majority of Americans supported increased gun control measures. But the powerful lobbying influence of groups like the National Rifle Association, NRA, made it difficult to pass sweeping reforms. In addition to gun control, the shooting highlighted the importance of mental health care. While Stephen Paddock's exact motivations remain unclear, the tragedy sparked renewed calls for better mental health services to help identify and address warning signs of violence before it escalates. Some believe that improving access to mental health care and providing more resources for individuals struggling with mental illness could prevent future tragedies. However, mental health issues are complex, and while there was general agreement that better support systems were needed, the specific solutions remained a subject of debate. The Las Vegas shooting also served as a catalyst for changes in how public events are secured. After the massacre, event organizers began reevaluating their security measures and protocols. Large public gatherings, including concerts, festivals, and sporting events, became more heavily scrutinized for potential vulnerabilities. Many venues increased the presence of armed security personnel, introduced bag checks, and implemented more advanced screening procedures for attendees. While these measures were aimed at preventing further attacks, they also led to concerns about the erosion of privacy and the potential for excessive security measures that could make public events less enjoyable or more intimidating. Striking a balance between safety and freedom remained a complex issue that required ongoing discussions between law enforcement, event organizers, and the public. The impact of the Las Vegas shooting also reverberated globally. It prompted other countries to reflect on their own gun control policies and public safety measures. In the United States, the attack underscored the ongoing problem of gun violence that had become all too common. It became one of the many incidents in a series of mass shootings that continued to shake the nation, sparking further debates over how best to address the issue. As the years went on, the tragic events of October 1, 2017, became a symbol of the broader crisis of gun violence in America. The massacre at the Route 91 Harvest Festival represented not just an isolated event, but part of a larger, deeply ingrained pattern of violence that had taken root in the country. Despite the efforts of survivors, advocates, and lawmakers, the problem of gun violence persisted, and the tragedy at Las Vegas remained a stark reminder of the dangers posed by the easy access to firearms and the inability to prevent attacks before they occur. For those who survived the attack, the emotional and psychological toll would linger for years. Many survivors found solace in sharing their stories and supporting each other. Support groups and counseling services provided essential help, but the trauma of witnessing such an atrocity would never be entirely erased. The event became a turning point in their lives, shaping how they viewed public safety, gun violence, and their own sense of security in the world. The Route 91 Harvest Festival shooting was a tragedy that reshaped how people view mass shootings, public safety, and the need for meaningful change in the way guns are regulated in the United States. It was a reminder of the vulnerability of individuals in public spaces and the devastating impact that one person's actions can have on an entire community. While some progress has been made in terms of legal and policy changes, the fight for better gun control, improved public safety, and a stronger mental health care system remains ongoing. For those affected by the attack, the memory of the victims would never fade. The survivors and families of the victims continue to honor the lives lost through advocacy, remembrance, and support for one another. The events of October 1, 2017, will remain a tragic chapter in American history, but it also stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the strength of those who refuse to let violence define their lives. The fight for justice, safety, and change continues in the hope that such a devastating event will never be repeated. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. In 2016, one of the most shocking and tragic events in the United States occurred when a man named Omar Mateen carried out a mass shooting at Pulse, a popular nightclub in Orlando, Florida. This horrific event took place on June 12, 2016, and became one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history at that time. The attack killed 49 people and injured 53 others, leaving an indelible mark on the community and the nation. Pulse was known as a vibrant and welcoming nightclub, especially for the LGBTQ+ community. Located in the heart of Orlando, it had been a popular venue for locals and tourists alike. That night, the club was hosting Latin Night, an event that attracted a large number of people. The atmosphere was festive, with music playing and people dancing and enjoying themselves. It was around 2 a.m. when the unimaginable occurred. A lone gunman, later identified as Omar Mateen, entered the nightclub with an assault rifle and a handgun. Mateen, who was 29 years old at the time, began shooting indiscriminately into the crowd. His assault was swift and deadly. Witnesses described the panic and confusion that followed. People ran in every direction, some trying to hide in bathrooms, others attempting to escape through windows, and many making desperate calls to loved ones, not knowing whether they would survive the attack. The gunman's actions were deliberate and methodical. He shot at anyone in his line of sight, making it nearly impossible for people to find safety. As the shooting unfolded, Mateen called 911 and declared his allegiance to ISIS, claiming that he was carrying out the attack in the name of terrorism. This prompted law enforcement to treat the situation as a terrorist act. The FBI was immediately involved in the response, and the area surrounding Pulse was soon locked down by police officers. The Orlando Police Department responded quickly, but by the time they arrived, Mateen had already caused significant devastation. During the attack, Mateen continued to make sporadic phone calls, speaking with negotiators, and even talking to a 911 operator during the standoff. At the time of the shooting, the nightclub was packed with approximately 300 people. The victims included people of various ages and backgrounds, from young adults to middle-aged individuals. The majority of those killed were members of the LGBTQ+ community, and many were people of Latin American descent, which added to the complexity and significance of the tragedy. The attack not only shocked the city of Orlando but resonated across the nation and around the world. The Orlando Police Department, along with the FBI, launched a complex operation to bring an end to the situation. The standoff between Mateen and law enforcement officers lasted for several hours. As the gunman remained inside the club, hostages were trapped in a dangerous and terrifying situation. Law enforcement officers, including SWAT teams, worked tirelessly to assess the situation and attempt to make entry into the building. While this was happening, paramedics were stationed nearby, waiting to treat any survivors and transport them to nearby hospitals. After several hours of negotiations, the situation escalated. Mateen, who had been holding hostages inside the club, began firing again, prompting police to take immediate action. SWAT officers breached the building around 5 a.m. As they entered, Mateen continued to fire at them, but he was eventually shot and killed by officers. The chaos inside the club was unimaginable, with victims still trapped and others desperately trying to escape. When law enforcement finally entered Pulse, they found the full extent of the devastation. Many people had been killed or severely injured. The club, which had once been a place of joy and celebration, was now the site of unimaginable horror. Victims were carried out of the building, some alive and others already lost. Paramedics and police officers worked tirelessly to save as many lives as possible, but the number of injuries and fatalities was staggering. In total, 49 people lost their lives in the attack, and more than 50 others were injured, many critically. The victims came from various walks of life, but the overwhelming majority were young adults. Many of the victims were in their 20s and 30s, enjoying a night out with friends or partners. The emotional impact on their families, friends, and communities was profound, as it felt like a personal attack on an entire group of people who had gathered in celebration of who they were. The LGBTQ+ community, in particular, was devastated by the targeting of their safe space and the violence that had occurred. In the aftermath of the shooting, law enforcement began a thorough investigation into Omar Mateen's background and possible motives. Mateen, who was born in New York to Afghan immigrant parents, had been living in Fort Pierce, Florida. He worked as a security guard and had been employed by the private security firm G4S. At the time of the attack, he was reportedly in contact with his wife and friends, who later claimed that they had not known about his intentions. However, there were reports that Mateen had visited Pulse several times before the shooting, leading authorities to question whether he had planned the attack for some time. Mateen's history was marked by troubling incidents, though there was no clear indication that he would carry out such a violent act. In 2013, he had been investigated by the FBI after making inflammatory comments to co-workers that suggested possible connections to terrorism. However, he was cleared after further investigation. This raised questions about whether he could have been stopped before the attack occurred. Mateen had also been the subject of prior scrutiny because of his personal life. He had exhibited erratic behavior and had a history of violent tendencies, but he had not been arrested or charged with anything serious prior to the attack. The investigation into Mateen's motives was complex and multifaceted. The claim that he was carrying out the attack in the name of ISIS prompted concerns about the rise of homegrown terrorism. However, experts were divided on whether Mateen was genuinely motivated by extremist ideologies or if his actions were driven by personal struggles, including possible issues with his sexuality. His public declaration of allegiance to ISIS was seen by some as a way of justifying his violence, rather than a true reflection of his beliefs. It became clear that while Mateen may have been influenced by global terrorism, his motivations were deeply personal, making it difficult to pinpoint an exact cause for the attack. As the investigation into the Pulse nightclub shooting continued, law enforcement agencies and authorities worked relentlessly to understand Omar Mateen's background and to determine how he had planned and executed such a heinous act. While Mateen's claim to be acting in the name of ISIS raised concerns about global terrorism, there was no clear evidence of direct connections between him and the terrorist organization. The investigation revealed that Mateen had expressed conflicting views on his motivations, and his actions seemed to stem from a complex mixture of personal and ideological factors. A critical aspect of the investigation centered on his mental state and personal history. Mateen had been married to a woman named Noor Salman, and investigators focused on whether she had known about his plans. Salman later claimed that she was unaware of her husband's intentions and had not known that he was planning a mass shooting. However, she was arrested and charged with aiding and abetting Mateen, accused of helping him scout the location of Pulse and providing him with assistance prior to the attack. These charges led to further scrutiny of Mateen's personal life, and many questioned whether there were signs of his intentions that were overlooked by those closest to him. Eventually, Salman was acquitted of all charges in 2018, as the prosecution could not prove that she had knowingly participated in the attack. Mateen's troubling behavior in the years leading up to the shooting also raised red flags. According to his former colleagues and acquaintances, Mateen was known to have had volatile moods and a history of violent outbursts. Several individuals reported that Mateen had made derogatory comments about LGBTQ+ individuals, which led some to believe that his actions on the night of the shooting were not entirely motivated by terrorist ideologies, but by personal hatred toward a community that he disapproved of. Some speculated that Mateen may have been struggling with internalized homophobia, as he had been seen at Pulse on multiple occasions before the attack. This contradictory and complex set of factors made it difficult to understand the exact motivation behind the attack and led to widespread confusion and shock in the wake of the massacre. Despite his personal issues, Mateen had legally obtained firearms, including an AR-15 style rifle and a handgun, both of which he used during the attack. This fact raised serious questions about the ease with which he had been able to purchase such dangerous weapons. Mateen's case brought attention to issues regarding gun control and the loopholes in the U.S. firearms system. Although Mateen had been investigated by the FBI in the past, he was not on any terrorist watch list, and he had passed the background checks required to legally acquire firearms. This raised concerns among lawmakers and the public about the effectiveness of background checks, and whether more stringent measures were needed to prevent individuals with violent tendencies from obtaining firearms. The Pulse shooting underscored the ongoing debate over gun control in the United States. In the wake of the attack, many advocates called for stronger regulations on firearms, especially assault weapons, which are capable of inflicting massive casualties in a short amount of time. The public outcry intensified, especially after it became clear that a man with a history of violent behavior could legally purchase high-powered firearms. Many survivors and victims' families joined the call for action, demanding changes to the law to prevent future tragedies. In addition to the gun control debate, the shooting also brought renewed focus to the safety of public spaces and large gatherings. Prior to the attack, events like concerts, clubs, and festivals were often seen as relatively safe environments. However, the events at Pulse shattered this perception, prompting a re-evaluation of security measures at public events nationwide. The need for increased security at such venues became clear, as it was impossible to predict when and where another mass shooting could occur. The shooting prompted changes in how security was handled at large events, with more venues investing in additional security measures, such as metal detectors, bag checks, and armed security personnel. For many people in the LGBTQ+ community, The attack on Pulse was a particularly painful and personal tragedy. The nightclub had been a safe space for people to express themselves and be part of a community without fear of discrimination or violence. The attack at Pulse shattered this sense of safety, and many LGBTQ+ individuals felt vulnerable and targeted in a way they had never experienced before. The shooting also highlighted the challenges faced by the LGBTQ+ community, who have long struggled with prejudice and violence. In the wake of the attack, there was an outpouring of support from people across the country, including many in the LGBTQ+ community, who gathered for vigils, protests, and memorials to honor the lives lost in the shooting. One of the most poignant moments following the massacre was the unity displayed by people from all walks of life. In the aftermath, Orlando became a symbol of resilience and solidarity. The city held memorial services, and various groups and organizations worked together to provide support for the survivors and the families of the victims. The LGBTQ+ community, in particular, came together to offer love and support for those affected by the tragedy. Despite the grief and sorrow, many found strength in the knowledge that the spirit of love and acceptance would continue to thrive, even in the face of such a violent and senseless act. The emotional and psychological toll on the survivors was immense. Many survivors of the attack were left with lasting trauma, dealing with both physical and emotional scars. In the months and years following the shooting, survivors faced challenges related to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Many survivors sought counseling and therapy to cope with the trauma, and the community as a whole worked to provide resources and support. The psychological effects of the attack were not only felt by those who were physically injured, but also by those who witnessed the horror and lost friends and loved ones. The event marked a turning point in the lives of those affected, as they struggled to come to terms with the violence they had witnessed and experienced. The Pulse nightclub shooting became a significant moment in the ongoing discussion about gun violence, LGBTQ+ rights, and the safety of public spaces. While the attack was a tragic event, it also prompted a national conversation about the need for change. In the years following the shooting, many advocates, survivors, and community leaders worked to ensure that the victims would not be forgotten and that their deaths would inspire action. The incident highlighted the need for stronger gun control, better mental health care, and greater protections for marginalized communities. The attack at Pulse was not just a moment of violence. It became a catalyst for change and an ongoing reminder of the work that still needed to be done to protect people and ensure that such tragedies would never happen again. In the aftermath of the Pulse nightclub shooting, the national and global reaction was one of shock, sadness, and a profound sense of loss. However, the tragedy also spurred a number of significant movements and changes in the way people, communities, and lawmakers addressed issues surrounding violence, gun control, and LGBTQ+ rights. One of the most immediate responses to the attack was the outpouring of support from both the local community in Orlando and from people across the world. Thousands of people gathered for vigils, protests, and memorial services to honor the victims and show solidarity with the LGBTQ+ community. The rainbow flag, a symbol of LGBTQ+ pride and acceptance, became a prominent image in these gatherings, and many people took part in events to express their determination to stand against hate, intolerance, and violence. The tragedy also led to a renewed conversation about the rights and protection of LGBTQ+ individuals. For many in the LGBTQ+ community, Pulse had been a sanctuary, a safe space where they could gather freely without fear of discrimination or persecution. The attack on this symbol of safety deepened concerns about the vulnerability of LGBTQ+ individuals to violence and hate. In the wake of the shooting, LGBTQ+ advocacy groups and community leaders called for stronger protections and more inclusive policies to ensure the safety and rights of people in the LGBTQ+ community. This incident added momentum to efforts to pass non-discrimination laws, strengthen hate crime legislation, and ensure that LGBTQ+ individuals were granted equal protection under the law, both in the U.S. and around the world. The Pulse shooting also significantly impacted the broader public's understanding of gun violence in the United States. The attack reignited debates about the accessibility of firearms, particularly assault weapons, and the ease with which people could acquire high-powered guns. As mentioned earlier, Omar Mateen had legally purchased an AR-15 style rifle and a handgun, which he used to carry out the massacre. Many advocates for stricter gun control laws were horrified by the fact that Mateen was able to obtain these weapons despite his previous interactions with law enforcement and his disturbing behavior. In the wake of the shooting, calls for reform intensified, with a particular focus on regulating military-style weapons and enhancing background checks. While some progress was made in certain areas, such as a ban on bump stocks, a device used to modify firearms for rapid fire, by the federal government in 2018, the broader issue of gun control remained deeply divisive. Gun rights activists argued that more restrictive gun laws would infringe upon Americans' Second Amendment rights, while gun control advocates argued that common-sense measures, such as universal background checks and restrictions on assault weapons, were necessary to protect public safety. The Pulse shooting became one of many high-profile incidents that showcased the difficulty in finding common ground on the issue of gun violence in the U.S. Another major area of concern that arose from the Pulse shooting was the issue of mental health. Omar Mateen's background and actions raised questions about whether more could have been done to identify individuals at risk of committing violent acts. Although Mateen had been investigated by the FBI prior to the shooting, he was not placed on any no-fly list or banned from purchasing firearms. This raised questions about the effectiveness of current systems for monitoring individuals who may pose a threat to public safety. Mental health professionals and advocacy groups pushed for greater funding and resources to improve mental health care in the United States, hoping to prevent future tragedies by identifying warning signs earlier and providing better support to those at risk. The Pulse shooting also highlighted the role of law enforcement in responding to mass shootings. The law enforcement response to the incident, while swift and effective in eventually neutralizing the shooter, raised questions about how law enforcement agencies prepare for and respond to such crises. The incident led to a re-examination of police training, particularly regarding how officers respond to mass shooting situations, as well as the equipment and resources available to handle such emergencies. Many police departments across the country began re-evaluating their protocols for handling mass casualty events, including the use of specialized teams and equipment to quickly address active shooter situations. While the tragedy at Pulse deeply affected the LGBTQ+ community, it also helped foster greater unity among people of all backgrounds. The response to the attack demonstrated that the desire for justice and equality transcends divisions of race, sexual orientation, and background. People from all walks of life rallied together to support the victims, raise awareness about issues of discrimination, and promote messages of love and unity. The hashtag #WeAreOrlando became a symbol of solidarity, and the city of Orlando emerged as a beacon of resilience in the face of unimaginable grief. In the years following the attack, the victims of the Pulse nightclub shooting were not forgotten. Memorials were created, including a permanent tribute in Orlando to honor the lives lost. These memorials serve as a space for reflection and remembrance, not only for the victims, but also for the survivors and the broader community that was affected by the tragedy. The families of the victims, many of whom became advocates for change, continue to work to ensure that their loved ones' deaths were not in vain and that steps are taken to prevent future tragedies. For the survivors of the attack, the journey toward healing was long and painful. Many survivors experienced deep psychological trauma, including post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and anxiety. The emotional and mental scars of the attack were just as damaging as the physical injuries for many of those who were caught in the violence. Survivors sought therapy and counseling, but the process of healing was slow and ongoing. Some survivors also took on the role of advocates, sharing their stories and working to raise awareness about the effects of gun violence and the importance of mental health care. The Pulse nightclub shooting was a moment of profound tragedy and loss, but it was also a turning point in the national conversation about gun violence, LGBTQ+ rights, and the need for stronger protections for marginalized communities. It became a symbol of both the devastating consequences of hate and violence, and the enduring strength of people coming together in the face of adversity. The massacre was a reminder that, while such acts of violence can never be fully erased, the efforts to heal, change, and protect future generations must continue. The survivors, the families of the victims, and the people of Orlando have shown incredible resilience in the wake of such a tragic event. Though the scars of the Pulse shooting will never fully heal, the spirit of love, unity, and acceptance that emerged from the tragedy serves as a testament to the strength of the human spirit in overcoming hate and violence. The lessons learned from Pulse continue to shape the ongoing fight for justice, equality, and peace. Let's jump to next story. Story 8. In 2017, one of the most significant and shocking criminal cases in the United States involved the Las Vegas shooting, which remains one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history. On the night of October 1st, 2017, a man named Stephen Paddock carried out a massacre during the Route 91 Harvest Country Music Festival, held on the Las Vegas Strip. The attack killed 58 people and injured over 850 others, leaving a trail of devastation, heartbreak, and confusion that still resonates with many to this day. Stephen Paddock, a 64-year-old retired accountant, did not appear to fit the profile of a typical mass shooter. He lived in Mesquite, Nevada, in a quiet, affluent neighborhood, and he had no prior criminal record. There were no indications that he had violent tendencies, nor did he have any known associations with extremist groups or ideologies. In fact, Paddock was a somewhat reclusive individual, and his background did not provide any obvious warning signs for authorities. His actions on that fateful night, however, shocked the entire nation and left investigators grappling to understand what motivated such a horrific crime. The Route 91 Harvest Festival was a popular event, attracting country music fans from across the United States. On the night of the shooting, an estimated 22,000 people gathered to watch a performance by country music artist Jason Aldean. The night was full of excitement and energy, with festival goers enjoying live music and the vibrant atmosphere. However, everything changed within a matter of moments when Paddock began firing on the crowd from his suite on the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Resort and Casino. Paddock had carefully planned his attack, bringing with him a large number of firearms, including rifles, and setting up an array of shooting devices that would allow him to fire from multiple vantage points. His suite overlooked the festival grounds, giving him a clear and uninterrupted view of the crowd. When the shooting began, it was initially difficult for people to understand what was happening. Many concertgoers first believed that the loud noises were fireworks or sound effects from the performance, but the truth soon became apparent. People quickly realized that they were under attack. The gunfire was relentless, with Paddock firing continuously for several minutes, hitting numerous victims who were either in the open or unable to find cover. Panic spread quickly through the crowd, with people scrambling to escape the gunfire. Concertgoers rushed for the exits, ducking for cover, and seeking safety in any way possible. People were injured in the chaos as they pushed and shoved to escape the deadly barrage. Emergency services were immediately called, but due to the scale of the attack and the location of the gunman, the situation was unlike any other mass shooting authorities had ever dealt with. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, along with SWAT teams, responded rapidly to the scene, but Paddock was positioned in a way that made it difficult for officers to pinpoint his location. He had set up a sniper's perch, giving him a significant advantage over law enforcement. For nearly 10 minutes, Paddock continued to fire into the crowd, without being interrupted. By the time officers reached his hotel room, Paddock had already turned his weapons on himself. He was found dead in his suite from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The aftermath of the shooting left first responders and survivors reeling from the scale of the violence they had witnessed. Law enforcement officers began the difficult process of securing the area and assisting the injured. Meanwhile, paramedics worked tirelessly to treat the wounded, many of whom had sustained gunshot wounds to their legs, arms, and torsos. In total, 58 people were killed in the attack, and hundreds more were injured, with many in critical condition. The trauma was not limited to the physical injuries, as many survivors were left with deep emotional scars. The event left the entire city of Las Vegas in shock, as well as the rest of the nation, as the full extent of the tragedy became clear. In the days following the attack, law enforcement began the challenging task of investigating how and why Paddock carried out the massacre. They quickly discovered that he had rented a suite at the Mandalay Bay Resort for several days before the shooting. He had carefully stockpiled an arsenal of weapons, including a total of 23 firearms, many of which were equipped with bump stocks, devices that allow semi-automatic weapons to fire at a much faster rate. He had also brought large quantities of ammunition, which enabled him to fire for an extended period of time without needing to reload. What was even more troubling was that Paddock had carefully planned his actions, and there were no indications that he had any clear motives. He had not left behind a manifesto or any direct clues about why he chose this particular venue or why he targeted concert-goers. Investigators began to explore various theories, including the possibility that Paddock had a desire for notoriety or that he had been influenced by other mass shootings. He had no clear connection to extremist groups or political causes, which made it even more difficult for law enforcement to understand his motives. Despite the extensive investigation into Paddock's background, many questions about his motivations remain unanswered. He had no criminal history, and his financial records showed no signs of distress or financial ruin. There was no evidence that he was targeting anyone in particular, and many of the people he shot were random victims. The fact that Paddock seemed to carefully plan the attack, yet left behind so few clues, led some to question whether his actions were driven by personal demons or something more complex. The aftermath of the Las Vegas shooting led to a national conversation about the issue of gun control in the United States. Paddock's use of bump stocks, devices that can turn a semi-automatic rifle into one that mimics the rapid fire of a fully automatic weapon, prompted calls for stricter regulations on these devices. Although bump stocks were not illegal at the time, their use in the shooting sparked widespread outrage, and lawmakers began to push for legislation to ban them. In 2018, the federal government issued a ban on bump stocks, following significant public pressure in the wake of the shooting. The shooting also reignited debates about the accessibility of firearms in the United States. Many advocates for stricter gun laws argued that Paddock's ability to legally purchase an array of high-powered weapons, including assault rifles, was a sign that the current system was inadequate. In the years following the attack, various states and cities introduced proposals for stricter gun control measures, including background checks, waiting periods, and limitations on the sale of certain types of firearms. However, these efforts were met with strong opposition from gun rights groups, and the debate over gun control remained as contentious as ever. The Las Vegas shooting also highlighted the challenges that first responders face during mass casualty events. The sheer scale of the attack required an unprecedented response from emergency services. In addition to the efforts of law enforcement officers, paramedics, and medical professionals, the community also stepped up to assist. Local hospitals were overwhelmed with patients, and many volunteers offered their support. In the days following the Las Vegas shooting, a national outpouring of grief and support flooded in. Thousands of people gathered for vigils and memorial services, many of which were held in Las Vegas itself, where the shooting had occurred. Memorials were set up for the victims, and messages of support and solidarity were seen everywhere, including social media platforms, where people shared their thoughts and prayers for the survivors and victims' families. The shooting was not just a tragedy for those directly affected, but for the entire country, as it reminded Americans of the ever-present threat of gun violence and the vulnerability of public gatherings. As law enforcement continued their investigation, a sense of unease spread throughout the public. While the shooter, Stephen Paddock, had been killed by his own hand before officers could arrest him, the reasons behind his attack remained largely unknown. Paddock's lack of a criminal background and his sudden turn toward violence puzzled many, and the fact that there were no concrete motives raised fears about the unpredictability of such events. Investigators looked into every aspect of Paddock's life, from his finances to his personal relationships, but they were unable to pinpoint any specific triggers for the attack. His social media presence and online activities showed no signs of extremism, and his family members were equally bewildered by his actions. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the fact that, despite Paddock's extensive preparations and the large number of weapons he had stockpiled, he had never drawn significant attention from authorities. He had legally purchased 33 firearms over the course of a year and had made multiple trips to the Mandalay Bay resort. Some questioned why there were no red flags raised during this time, especially considering his purchase of bump stocks and the amount of ammunition he had acquired. While background checks were conducted during the purchase of his firearms, there was nothing in Paddock's history that would have raised suspicions under the existing laws. This revealed significant gaps in the system, particularly around the sale of semi-automatic weapons and accessories like bump stocks that could increase the lethality of firearms. As the investigation continued, it was clear that Paddock's attack was carefully orchestrated. In addition to the firearms, Paddock had also brought several suitcases filled with ammunition, and he had set up multiple cameras in his hotel suite to monitor his surroundings and alert him to anyone approaching. He had even placed cameras outside his hotel room door and in the hallway, possibly in an attempt to avoid detection by law enforcement. It seemed that Paddock had gone to great lengths to ensure that his attack would be as devastating as possible. In the end, the meticulousness of the planning made the scale of the violence even more horrifying. The attack highlighted the increasing sophistication of mass shooters, who often take steps to ensure their attacks are well planned and executed. For years, mass shootings in the United States had typically been carried out by individuals with little preparation or forethought, often targeting a specific group or individual. But in Paddock's case, the attack was indiscriminate, aimed at a large, vulnerable crowd, and designed for maximum carnage. This was a stark reminder that mass shooters were capable of planning and executing attacks in ways that authorities and the public often struggled to predict or prevent. Paddock's attack also led to increased scrutiny of the country's security infrastructure, particularly at public events and large gatherings. Concerts, festivals, and sporting events, once considered safe and fun spaces, were now seen as potential targets for mass shootings. The Las Vegas shooting caused many event organizers, law enforcement agencies, and security experts to re-examine their safety protocols. There were discussions about how to improve security at large venues, including the possibility of installing metal detectors, increasing the presence of armed security, and using surveillance technologies to detect suspicious behavior. Although many venues began adopting more rigorous security measures in the wake of the attack, there were also concerns about how these measures might affect the overall experience of attendees. Balancing safety and freedom at public events became a new challenge for authorities and event planners alike. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the Las Vegas shooting was the number of lives lost and the lasting impact on the victims' families and survivors. The 58 people who were killed that night ranged in age from 20 to 67 and came from different backgrounds, including many who were attending the festival with family and friends. The survivors, many of whom sustained life-altering injuries, faced a long and difficult road to recovery. Some were left with permanent physical scars, while others struggled with emotional and psychological trauma that would last for years. Many survivors spoke publicly about their experiences, advocating for greater gun control measures and raising awareness about the need for mental health support for people affected by trauma. In addition to the physical and emotional wounds, there was a growing concern over the long-term effects of the shooting on the community of Las Vegas. The city, known for its vibrant tourism and entertainment industry, suddenly became associated with one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history. Local businesses, many of which had depended on the influx of tourists attending events like the Route 91 Harvest Festival, were deeply affected by the tragedy. The impact was not just limited to the immediate area of the shooting, but was felt throughout the broader Las Vegas community. Efforts to rebuild the city's sense of safety and normalcy were underway, but it was clear that the scars of the tragedy would not fade quickly. Despite the unimaginable grief, there were many stories of resilience and strength that emerged in the wake of the shooting. First responders, including police officers, paramedics, and medical professionals, were praised for their swift and brave actions in treating the injured and securing the area. Volunteers from all over the country traveled to Las Vegas to offer support and assist with recovery efforts. Many survivors, despite their pain, reached out to help others, donating blood or speaking at public forums about their experiences. Their courage in the face of such horror demonstrated the power of human compassion and the determination to heal and rebuild after tragedy. The response to the shooting also highlighted the need for stronger gun control laws in the United States. Advocacy groups, led by victims' families, survivors, and activists, continued to push for reforms. Although some progress was made, such as the federal ban on bump stocks in 2018, the debate over gun control remained contentious. While some states, like California and Nevada, passed stricter gun laws, the federal government faced significant opposition from pro-gun lobbyists and organizations, such as the National Rifle Association (NRA). The Las Vegas shooting became a focal point in the broader conversation about gun violence and the role of firearms in American society. While the motives behind Stephen Paddock's attack may never be fully understood, the impact of the Las Vegas shooting was undeniable. The massacre was a tragic reminder of the dangers posed by firearms in the United States. In the days following the Las Vegas shooting, a national outpouring of grief and support flooded in. Thousands of people gathered for vigils and memorial services, many of which were held in Las Vegas itself, where the shooting had occurred. Memorials were set up for the victims, and messages of support and solidarity were seen everywhere, including social media platforms, where people shared their thoughts and prayers for the survivors and victims' families. The shooting was not just a tragedy for those directly affected, but for the entire country, as it reminded Americans of the ever-present threat of gun violence and the vulnerability of public gatherings. As law enforcement continued their investigation, a sense of unease spread throughout the public. While the shooter, Stephen Paddock, had been killed by his own hand before officers could arrest him, the reasons behind his attack remained largely unknown. Paddock's lack of a criminal background and his sudden turn toward violence puzzled many, and the fact that there were no concrete motives raised fears about the unpredictability of such events. Investigators looked into every aspect of Paddock's life, from his finances to his personal relationships, but they were unable to pinpoint any specific triggers for the attack. His social media presence and online activities showed no signs of extremism, and his family members were equally bewildered by his actions. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was the fact that, despite Paddock's extensive preparations and the large number of weapons he had stockpiled, he had never drawn significant attention from authorities. He had legally purchased 33 firearms over the course of a year and had made multiple trips to the Mandalay Bay resort. Some questioned why there were no red flags raised during this time, especially considering his purchase of bump stocks and the amount of ammunition he had acquired. While background checks were conducted during the purchase of his firearms, there was nothing in Paddock's history that would have raised suspicions under the existing laws. This revealed significant gaps in the system, particularly around the sale of semi-automatic weapons and accessories like bump stocks that could increase the lethality of firearms. As the investigation continued, it was clear that Paddock's attack was carefully orchestrated. In addition to the firearms, Paddock had also brought several suitcases filled with ammunition, and he had set up multiple cameras in his hotel suite to monitor his surroundings and alert him to anyone approaching. He had even placed cameras outside his hotel room door and in the hallway, possibly in an attempt to avoid detection by law enforcement. It seemed that Paddock had gone to great lengths to ensure that his attack would be as devastating as possible. In the end, the meticulousness of the planning made the scale of the violence even more horrifying. The attack highlighted the increasing sophistication of mass shooters, who often take steps to ensure their attacks are well planned and executed. For years, mass shootings in the United States had typically been carried out by individuals with little preparation or forethought, often targeting a specific group or individual. But in Paddock's case, the attack was indiscriminate, aimed at a large, vulnerable crowd, and designed for maximum carnage. This was a stark reminder that mass shooters were capable of planning and executing attacks in ways that authorities and the public often struggled to predict or prevent. Paddock's attack also led to increased scrutiny of the country's security infrastructure, particularly at public events and large gatherings. Concerts, festivals, and sporting events, once considered safe and fun spaces, were now seen as potential targets for mass shootings. The Las Vegas shooting caused many event organizers, law enforcement agencies, and security experts to re-examine their safety protocols. There were discussions about how to improve security at large venues, including the possibility of installing metal detectors, increasing the presence of armed security, and using surveillance technologies to detect suspicious behavior. Although many venues began adopting more rigorous security measures in the wake of the attack, there were also concerns about how these measures might affect the overall experience of attendees. Balancing safety and freedom at public events became a new challenge for authorities and event planners alike. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the Las Vegas shooting was the number of lives lost and the lasting impact on the victims' families and survivors. The 58 people who were killed that night ranged in age from 20 to 67 and came from different backgrounds, including many who were attending the festival with family and friends. The survivors, many of whom sustained life-altering injuries, faced a long and difficult road to recovery. Some were left with permanent physical scars, while others struggled with emotional and psychological trauma that would last for years. Many survivors spoke publicly about their experiences, advocating for greater gun control measures and raising awareness about the need for mental health support for people affected by trauma. In addition to the physical and emotional wounds, there was a growing concern over the long-term effects of the shooting on the community of Las Vegas. The city, known for its vibrant tourism and entertainment industry, suddenly became associated with one of the deadliest mass shootings in American history. Local businesses, many of which had depended on the influx of tourists attending events like the Route 91 Harvest Festival, were deeply affected by the tragedy. The impact was not just limited to the immediate area of the shooting, but was felt throughout the broader Las Vegas community. Efforts to rebuild the city's sense of safety and normalcy were underway, but it was clear that the scars of the tragedy would not fade quickly. Despite the unimaginable grief, there were many stories of resilience and strength that emerged in the wake of the shooting. First responders, including police officers, paramedics, and medical professionals, were praised for their swift and brave actions in treating the injured and securing the area. Volunteers from all over the country traveled to Las Vegas to offer support and assist with recovery efforts. Many survivors, despite their pain, reached out to help others, donating blood or speaking at public forums about their experiences. Their courage in the face of such horror demonstrated the power of human compassion and the determination to heal and rebuild after tragedy. The response to the shooting also highlighted the need for stronger gun control laws in the United States. Advocacy groups, led by victims' families, survivors, and activists, continued to push for reforms. Although some progress was made, such as the federal ban on bump stocks in 2018, the debate over gun control remained contentious. While some states, like California and Nevada, passed stricter gun laws, the federal government faced significant opposition from pro-gun lobbyists and organizations, such as the National Rifle Association, NRA. The Las Vegas shooting became a focal point in the broader conversation about gun violence and the role of firearms in American society. In the years following the Las Vegas shooting, the country continued to wrestle with the consequences of that tragic night. Although the investigation into Stephen Paddock's motives remained inconclusive, the shooting had an undeniable impact on both public policy and the broader societal conversation around gun violence. Despite the heartbreak and confusion, there were significant efforts to address the issues raised by the attack, including calls for stronger gun control laws, better mental health support, and more comprehensive safety measures at large public events. One of the most significant actions in the aftermath of the Las Vegas shooting was the renewed debate over gun control. In particular, the use of bump stocks in the attack reignited the conversation about the regulation of firearms accessories. These devices, which allow a semi-automatic rifle to mimic the firing rate of a fully automatic weapon, were central to the horror of the shooting, as they enabled Paddock to fire rapidly and continuously into the crowd. In response to public outcry, the U.S. government moved to regulate bump stocks, and in 2018, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, issued a ban on the device, effectively making them illegal. The ban on bump stocks was a step toward addressing one of the immediate concerns raised by the Las Vegas shooting, but it also highlighted the broader issues surrounding gun violence in the U.S. For many advocates of stricter gun control, the Las Vegas attack underscored the ease with which an individual could legally acquire high-powered firearms and accessories that made it easier to carry out such devastating attacks. Calls for expanded background checks, limitations on high-capacity magazines, and restrictions on assault-style weapons gained traction in the wake of the massacre. However, these measures faced fierce opposition from powerful pro-gun groups like the NRA, which argued that any restrictions on firearms would infringe upon Americans' Second Amendment rights. Despite the polarized political climate, some states took action independently of federal policy. In Nevada, for example, lawmakers passed a law that required background checks for all private gun sales, closing a loophole that had previously allowed individuals to bypass background checks in certain situations. Other states, including California and Florida, also introduced new gun safety laws in response to the Las Vegas shooting, including restrictions on high-capacity magazines and laws that required reporting of lost or stolen firearms. While these state-level efforts were a step in the right direction, the issue of gun violence in the U.S. remained far from resolved, and the debate continued to divide the nation. In addition to the push for gun control, the Las Vegas shooting also sparked conversations about mental health and its role in mass violence. Although Paddock did not have a known history of mental illness, the fact that he was able to carry out such a calculated attack raised questions about whether more could have been done to identify individuals at risk of committing mass violence. Advocates for mental health reform argued that the U.S. needed better systems for identifying warning signs and providing support for those with mental health issues before they reached a breaking point. The Las Vegas shooting also brought attention to the broader issue of trauma and recovery. Many survivors of the attack faced long-term psychological challenges, including PTSD, depression, and anxiety. In the aftermath of the shooting, mental health professionals emphasized the importance of providing adequate support and resources for those affected by mass violence, not just in the immediate aftermath, but over the long term. As more and more mass shootings occurred across the country, it became clear that mental health care would be an essential part of the conversation on how to respond to these tragedies. For the survivors, the road to healing was long and difficult. Many spoke about the lasting effects of the trauma they had experienced, whether physical, emotional, or psychological. Some of the survivors who had been shot or injured faced a lengthy recovery, enduring surgeries and rehabilitation to regain their physical health. For others, the mental and emotional scars would never fully heal. Survivors formed support groups where they could share their stories, find comfort in one another, and advocate for changes in gun laws. These survivors became powerful voices in the ongoing conversation about gun violence, urging lawmakers to take action to prevent future tragedies. The families of the victims also continued to carry the weight of their loss, but many of them channeled their grief into activism. They joined forces with survivors and advocacy groups to demand stronger gun control laws and greater accountability for gun manufacturers and sellers. The families of those lost in the Las Vegas shooting made it clear that they would not let their loved ones' deaths be in vain. They took part in rallies, spoke with lawmakers, and worked to raise awareness about the toll that gun violence takes on families, communities, and the country as a whole. The legacy of the Las Vegas shooting also extended to the broader discussion of public safety at events. In the wake of the attack, security at large public venues, including concerts, festivals, and sporting events, became a major focus. Event organizers and law enforcement agencies began rethinking their security protocols, implementing new measures to prevent similar tragedies. This included the increased use of metal detectors, surveillance cameras, and security personnel at public events. While these measures were put in place to protect people, they also raised questions about the balance between ensuring safety and preserving the sense of freedom and enjoyment that people expect when attending public gatherings. In the years since the attack, the Las Vegas shooting has remained a powerful symbol of the need for change in the way the U.S. addresses gun violence. While some progress has been made, much work remains to be done to address the root causes of such violence and to prevent future tragedies. The event serves as a reminder that, despite the best efforts of law enforcement, mental health professionals, and advocacy groups, mass shootings continue to be a reality in America. The memories of those lost in the attack, the courage of the survivors, and the efforts of families and activists to create change have helped shape the ongoing conversation about gun violence and the steps that need to be taken to protect future generations. Ultimately, the Las Vegas shooting was a turning point in the national conversation about mass shootings and gun violence in America. While no single law or policy change can prevent every tragedy, the collective efforts of survivors, families, and advocates have created a sense of urgency in addressing the issue. The event left an indelible mark on Las Vegas and on the entire nation, reminding Americans of the need to work together to prevent such horrors from happening again. Let's jump to next story. Story 9. In 2018, one of the most tragic and widely publicized criminal events in the United States was the shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. The incident, which took place on February 14, 2018, claimed the lives of 17 people and left 17 others injured. The shooter, 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz, targeted the school in a horrific attack that would forever change the community of Parkland, as well as the broader conversation surrounding gun control, mental health, and school safety in the U.S. Nicholas Cruz, a former student of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, had a troubled history. He was known to have been expelled from the school for disciplinary reasons prior to the attack, and he had been involved in several troubling incidents during his time there. Cruz had a history of mental health issues and behavioral problems, and he had been receiving counseling in the years leading up to the shooting. Despite these red flags, Cruz was able to legally purchase a rifle from a gun store in Florida, using a background check that revealed no criminal history or significant issues that would prevent him from buying a weapon. This highlighted a critical flaw in the system that allowed individuals like Cruz to acquire firearms despite signs of instability. On the day of the shooting, Cruz arrived at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School carrying an AR-15 style rifle. He had concealed the weapon in a black bag and waited until he was inside the school to begin his attack. Cruz entered the school around 2:20 p.m., when classes were still in session, and immediately began shooting at students and faculty members. The attack lasted for just under 6 minutes, but in that short time, Cruz managed to fire dozens of rounds into the classrooms, hallways, and stairwells, killing 17 people and injuring many more. The victims included 14 students and 3 staff members, ranging in age from 14 to 49. Some were shot in the hallways, while others were in classrooms or simply trying to escape. The students and staff who were caught in the line of fire faced unimaginable terror as Cruz moved through the school, firing at random and showing no signs of mercy. Many students who survived later described the horror of hearing the gunshots and seeing their classmates and teachers fall. Some students had to barricade themselves in classrooms or hide in closets, unsure if they would survive the ordeal. Once Cruz had finished firing, he attempted to blend in with the fleeing students. He discarded his weapon and walked out of the school, blending into the crowd of people trying to escape the scene. He made his way to a nearby Walmart, where he was spotted by a police officer, but Cruz managed to flee the area before being apprehended. For hours, authorities searched for Cruz, fearing that he might strike again or have planned further attacks. It wasn't until the following day that Cruz was finally located and arrested by the Broward County Sheriff's Office. The arrest of Cruz was part of a swift and organized law enforcement response to the attack, but the damage had already been done. The community of Parkland was forever changed, and the tragedy sparked a nationwide outcry over the issue of gun violence in schools. In the weeks and months following the shooting, survivors and their families began speaking out, demanding change and calling for stricter gun control laws. The tragic event brought new attention to the problem of school shootings in the U.S., a problem that had plagued the country for years, but had often been met with inaction from lawmakers. Cruz's attack was not an isolated incident. School shootings had become an all-too-common occurrence in the United States, with several high-profile shootings having occurred in the years prior, including the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Connecticut and the 2017 shooting at a Texas church. Despite these tragedies, there had been little progress in addressing the root causes of gun violence or implementing meaningful changes to gun laws. The Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School shooting, however, became a turning point, as the survivors and families of the victims began to speak out in ways that would inspire a nationwide movement. One of the most powerful responses to the tragedy came from the students of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School themselves. In the days following the shooting, many students took to social media to express their grief and anger, but they quickly turned their attention to the issue of gun control. Students like Emma Gonzalez, David Hogg, and others became prominent voices in the debate, appearing on news programs, attending rallies, and organizing marches to demand stronger gun laws. They argued that it was time for lawmakers to take action to prevent future tragedies like the one that had occurred at their school. Their activism culminated in the March for Our Lives, a nationwide protest held on March 24, 2018, just over a month after the shooting. The march was organized by the students of Stoneman Douglas and supported by a broad coalition of activists, survivors, and gun control advocates. The event drew hundreds of thousands of people to Washington, D.C., and other cities across the country, all united in their call for stricter gun regulations and greater efforts to protect children and schools from gun violence. The march was seen as a powerful symbol of youth activism and a message to lawmakers that the public was demanding change. While the March for Our Lives was a significant moment in the movement for gun control, the issue was far from settled. In the aftermath of the shooting, there was a surge in public support for gun control, with polls showing that many Americans were in favor of stronger regulations, including universal background checks and bans on assault-style weapons. However, despite this public support, efforts to pass meaningful gun control laws were met with resistance from pro-gun groups and some lawmakers, particularly those in states with strong gun rights traditions. The shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School also sparked debates about the role of law enforcement in preventing such tragedies. In the days following the attack, it was revealed that the school resource officer, a Broward County Sheriff's deputy, had failed to enter the school building during the attack and had instead remained outside, a decision that many criticized as an egregious failure to act. This revelation led to further scrutiny of the school district's policies and the training of law enforcement officers tasked with protecting schools. The failure of the resource officer to respond quickly raised serious questions about the readiness of law enforcement to handle active shooter situations and led to calls for better training and protocols. In the wake of the shooting, there were also discussions about the role of mental health in preventing such violence. Cruz had a history of mental health issues, and some experts argued that better mental health care and more comprehensive interventions might have prevented the tragedy. However, the focus on mental health also raised concerns about the stigma surrounding mental illness and the potential for further criminalization of individuals with mental health disorders. Mental health advocacy groups emphasized the need for better resources and support systems, rather than focusing solely on the criminalization of those with mental health issues. As Cruz's trial approached, the legal system also began to examine his actions and motivations in greater detail. Cruz was charged with 17 counts of first-degree murder and 17 counts of attempted murder. He pleaded guilty to the charges in 2021 and was subsequently sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial and sentencing process became another chapter in the ongoing quest for justice for the victims and their families, but it also highlighted the complex legal and emotional issues that arise in cases of mass violence. The families of the victims were left to navigate their own grief, while the public awaited the resolution of the legal proceedings. As the legal process for Nicholas Cruz unfolded, the impact of the Parkland shooting continued to resonate throughout the United States, further galvanizing the ongoing debate about gun violence, school safety, and mental health. Survivors of the attack, along with the families of the victims, continued to push for meaningful changes to prevent future tragedies. One of the key issues that arose after the shooting was the question of how to improve school safety without resorting to arming teachers or creating a more militarized educational environment. In the months following the tragedy, there were multiple proposals introduced at both the state and national levels aimed at increasing security in schools. Some of these proposals involved the idea of arming teachers or hiring more armed security personnel to patrol school grounds. While some lawmakers and advocates for gun rights supported these ideas, many others, including survivors of the Parkland shooting, rejected them. They argued that adding more guns to schools would not address the root causes of gun violence and could potentially lead to more dangerous situations. Instead, many survivors and advocates called for stronger laws regulating firearms, including background checks for all gun purchases, restrictions on assault-style weapons, and limitations on high-capacity magazines. In Florida, where the shooting took place, state lawmakers passed some significant reforms in response to the tragedy. In March 2018, Florida Governor Rick Scott signed into law the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School Public Safety Act, which raised the minimum age to purchase a firearm from 18 to 21, banned bump stocks, and provided funding for school safety measures, such as the addition of armed officers in schools. However, the law did not include provisions for banning assault weapons, a key demand of many survivors and activists. The law was seen as a small step forward, but many felt it did not go far enough to address the root causes of gun violence or to ensure the safety of students in schools. At the federal level, the response to the Parkland shooting was far more divided. While public opinion polls showed broad support for measures such as universal background checks and restrictions on assault weapons, the U.S. Congress was slow to act. Gun control advocates, including organizations like Everytown for Gun Safety and the Brady Campaign, continued to push for new legislation, but their efforts were stymied by powerful pro-gun groups, including the National Rifle Association (NRA), which strongly opposed any new restrictions on firearms. Despite the momentum created by the Parkland shooting, the political climate in Washington, D.C. remained deeply polarized, and meaningful federal action on gun control was not forthcoming. The Parkland shooting also sparked an important conversation about the role of mental health in preventing mass violence. In the aftermath of the attack, Cruz's history of mental health issues was widely discussed. He had been diagnosed with emotional and behavioral problems as a child and had received treatment for depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions. In the years leading up to the shooting, Cruz exhibited signs of instability, including violent threats, social isolation, and an obsession with firearms. Many experts argued that better mental health care and early intervention could have prevented the tragedy. However, others cautioned that focusing on mental health could unfairly stigmatize individuals with mental illness and could lead to a dangerous oversimplification of the factors that contribute to mass shootings. While some advocated for improved mental health care and greater access to treatment, Others pointed to the ease with which Cruz was able to legally obtain firearms as a major factor in the tragedy. Cruz was able to purchase an AR-15 style rifle despite his troubling behavior and history of mental health issues. This highlighted the flaws in the existing background check system, which did not account for many warning signs, such as threats or behavioral problems, that might have indicated a potential danger to public safety. For many gun control advocates, the issue was not just about mental health, but about the need for stronger regulations on gun purchases and more comprehensive background checks to prevent dangerous individuals from obtaining weapons. In addition to the focus on gun control and mental health, the Parkland shooting prompted discussions about the role of law enforcement and the response to active shooter situations. In the wake of the attack, it was revealed that there had been multiple missed opportunities to intervene before the shooting took place. Cruz had been reported to law enforcement on several occasions for threatening behavior, and there were numerous warning signs that he was a potential threat to others. However, despite these warnings, law enforcement did not take sufficient action to prevent the shooting. This raised questions about the adequacy of current protocols for identifying and intervening with individuals who may pose a threat to public safety. The failure of law enforcement to respond adequately to Cruz's threats led to calls for better training for officers and improved procedures for addressing warning signs of violence. Many argued that the system of reporting and responding to potential threats was fragmented and inconsistent, and that more needed to be done to ensure that law enforcement had the tools and resources to identify and intervene before violence occurred. In Florida, the shooting led to the creation of the Office of School Safety, which was tasked with developing recommendations for improving school safety and preventing future shootings. The office focused on improving communication between schools, law enforcement, and mental health professionals, as well as developing new training programs for school staff and law enforcement. As the legal process for Cruz continued, the families of the victims and survivors remained focused on seeking justice and accountability. They held vigils, participated in protests, and continued to push for policy changes. The shooting also prompted a wider cultural shift, with survivors and activists becoming increasingly vocal in their demands for change. They argued that the time for thoughts and prayers was over, and that real action was needed to prevent future tragedies. The Parkland shooting ultimately served as a catalyst for the gun control movement, inspiring young people across the country to become more politically engaged and to take a stand against gun violence. The trial of Nicholas Cruz began in 2022, and while the legal process moved slowly, it was clear that the emotional and societal impact of the shooting would last long beyond the courtroom. Cruz faced 17 counts of first-degree murder and 17 counts of attempted murder, and the trial would likely take years to fully resolve. For the victims' families and survivors, the pursuit of justice was not just about holding Cruz accountable for his actions, but also about ensuring that future generations would not have to live through similar tragedies. As the case of Parkland unfolded, it became evident that the struggle for meaningful change was far from over. Gun violence, school shootings, and the need for stronger regulations would remain pressing issues for the country, and the voices of those affected by the Parkland shooting would continue to inspire future generations to fight for a safer society. Let's jump to next story. Story 10. One of the most significant and tragic criminal events in 2018 in the United States was the shooting at the Borderline Bar and Grill in Thousand Oaks, California. On the night of November 7, 2018, a gunman opened fire inside the popular bar, killing 12 people and injuring many others before taking his own life. The shooting occurred during a weekly event called College Night, which was especially popular with young adults, and it became another devastating chapter in America's ongoing struggle with mass shootings and gun violence. The gunman, Ian David Long, was a 28-year-old former U.S. Marine who had a history of mental health issues. He had been involved in an incident with law enforcement in April 2018, when authorities had been called to his residence due to concerns about his behavior. Long had reportedly been acting erratically, and his mother had expressed concerns about his mental health. At that time, law enforcement officers spoke with Long, but no action was taken, and he was not arrested or detained. This incident raised important questions about how to identify and intervene with individuals who might be at risk of committing violence, especially when they show signs of mental instability. On the night of the shooting, Long entered the Borderline Bar and Grill wearing dark clothing and carrying a Glock 21 semi-automatic pistol, along with several magazines of ammunition. At around 11:20 p.m., he opened fire in the crowded bar, shooting indiscriminately into the crowd of patrons, most of whom were college students. The music was playing, and people were dancing when the gunshots rang out, causing chaos and panic. Many of the people present initially thought the sounds were part of the music or a prank, but it quickly became apparent that they were under attack. The victims of the shooting included people of various ages, ranging from 18 to 54 years old. The youngest victim was a 19-year-old college student, and the oldest was a 54-year-old man who had been visiting the bar with his son. Many of the victims were attending the college night event for the first time, eager to enjoy an evening of socializing and dancing. As the gunfire erupted, patrons rushed toward the exits, trying to escape the violence. Several of the survivors described the terrifying moments as they ran for their lives, with some having to crawl through windows or hide behind furniture to avoid being shot. Inside the bar, chaos ensued as people tried to make their way to safety. Some people were able to escape, while others were trapped inside the building with the gunman. Several people in the crowd attempted to take action and help others, including a security guard and a group of brave patrons who tried to distract Long or guide others to safety. However, despite their best efforts, the shooter continued his rampage, moving through the bar and shooting at random. As law enforcement officers arrived on the scene, they immediately began to work on evacuating survivors and securing the perimeter. Police SWAT teams quickly moved in, but they found that the gunman had already taken his own life. Long was found dead inside the bar from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Despite the best efforts of first responders, 12 people lost their lives that night, and many others were injured, either physically or psychologically, by the traumatic events they had witnessed. In the aftermath of the shooting, the community of Thousand Oaks was left in shock and mourning. Borderline Bar and Grill was a well-known establishment that had been a gathering place for locals, especially college students. Many of the victims were familiar faces within the community, and their deaths were deeply felt by friends, family, and neighbors. The tragic event also raised important questions about the growing epidemic of mass shootings in the United States and the difficulty of preventing such incidents, even when warning signs are present. The investigation into the shooting revealed disturbing details about the gunman's background. Ian Long had served in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he had been deployed to Afghanistan. It was reported that Long had been experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a condition that can affect individuals who have been exposed to traumatic events, such as combat. Long's behavior in the months leading up to the shooting, including the April incident with law enforcement, suggested that he was struggling with mental health issues. However, despite these warning signs, he was able to legally obtain the handgun used in the attack. Long's access to firearms became a central issue in the aftermath of the shooting. California has some of the strictest gun laws in the United States, and it was revealed that Long had legally purchased the Glock 21 pistol despite his mental health issues and the concerns raised by those who knew him. The shooting further fueled the debate over gun control laws in the U.S., with many questioning how someone with a history of mental health issues and violent tendencies could still be allowed to purchase a weapon. Advocates for stronger gun control laws pointed to the fact that Long was able to acquire firearms legally and argued that stricter regulations on gun sales were needed to prevent similar tragedies. The incident also brought attention to the role of mental health in mass shootings. Long's history of mental health problems, including PTSD, highlighted the need for better mental health care and interventions for individuals who may be at risk of committing violent acts. Many mental health professionals emphasize the importance of early intervention and support for people who show signs of instability, but the stigma surrounding mental illness often makes it difficult for people to seek help. Long's case underscored the need for a more comprehensive approach to mental health care, one that includes better access to treatment and more effective ways to identify and assist individuals who may be a danger to themselves or others. In the wake of the shooting, the community of Thousand Oaks came together to mourn and support one another. A memorial was held for the victims and survivors, as well as the families of the deceased, received an outpouring of support from the local community and beyond. The shooting was yet another reminder of the devastating effects of gun violence and the deep wounds left by such tragedies. It also sparked a renewed conversation about how to prevent similar incidents in the future, both through stronger gun laws and better mental health care. Law enforcement agencies also faced scrutiny in the aftermath of the attack, with many questioning whether more could have been done to prevent the shooting. While there was no direct indication that Long had been planning the attack in advance, there were warning signs that he was a troubled individual who may have posed a danger. The investigation into the shooting highlighted the need for better communication between law enforcement agencies, mental health professionals, and the public to identify individuals who may be at risk of committing mass violence. Despite the pain and tragedy that followed the Borderline Bar and Grill shooting, the survivors and families of the victims remained determined to ensure that their loved ones' deaths would not be forgotten. Many of them became vocal advocates for gun control and mental health reform, speaking out about the need for stronger laws to prevent mass shootings and better support systems for individuals with mental health issues. Their efforts to raise awareness about the dangers of gun violence and the importance of mental health care helped to keep the conversation going in the months and years following the attack. As the investigation into the Borderline Bar and Grill shooting continued, the public's attention turned to the broader implications of the tragedy. The shooting in Thousand Oaks, like so many others before it, ignited a fierce national debate on gun control, mental health, and the efficacy of existing laws designed to prevent mass shootings. While many Americans mourned the loss of innocent lives, others began to question why such incidents continued to happen, despite years of public outcry and calls for change. In California, where the shooting took place, the gun laws were already considered to be among the strictest in the country. California had implemented regulations aimed at preventing gun violence, including background checks for all gun purchases, mandatory waiting periods, and a ban on assault weapons. However, the tragic events of November 7, 2018, raised doubts about the effectiveness of these measures in preventing individuals with clear warning signs from obtaining firearms. The fact that Ian Long had been able to legally purchase a firearm, despite his history of mental health issues and prior interactions with law enforcement, served as a stark reminder that even the strongest state laws might not be enough to stop a determined individual from acquiring deadly weapons. Advocates for gun control used the Borderline Bar and Grill shooting as another example of the need for stronger national regulations. They pointed to the gaps in the background check system, as well as the lack of coordinated communication between law enforcement agencies, as areas that needed urgent reform. While California's laws were stricter than those in many other states, the failure of these measures to prevent the shooting raised concerns about the need for more uniform regulations across the United States. Many argued that the country needed a federal approach to gun control that would close loopholes and require all states to adopt similar regulations. In addition to the debate on gun laws, the shooting also sparked renewed conversations about mental health and its connection to violent crime. Ian Long's struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and his history of mental health issues raised questions about the mental health system in the U.S. Many experts argued that better access to mental health care and more resources for individuals with conditions like PTSD could have prevented the shooting. Long had reportedly been suffering from the effects of his military service, which included exposure to traumatic experiences during his deployment in Afghanistan. His mental health issues, coupled with his access to firearms, created a dangerous combination that ultimately led to the tragic events at the Borderline Bar and Grill. Mental health advocates emphasized the need for a comprehensive approach to addressing the mental health crisis in the U.S. They argued that improving mental health care access and reducing the stigma surrounding mental illness could help prevent future tragedies. Mental health issues often go untreated or undiagnosed, particularly in cases like Long's, where he had a history of violence and behavioral problems, but had not received adequate treatment or intervention. The shooting underscored the need for a more proactive approach to identifying individuals who may be at risk of committing violent acts and providing them with the necessary support. The failure to intervene in Long's case also raised questions about the role of law enforcement in preventing mass shootings. The April 2018 incident in which Long was reported to law enforcement for erratic behavior was a pivotal moment that could have led to further action. At that time, Long had exhibited signs of mental instability, and authorities had spoken to him, but ultimately decided not to take further steps. This failure to act was seen by many as a missed opportunity to prevent the shooting. Critics of the response argued that law enforcement needed better training to identify individuals who might pose a danger and to intervene before violence occurred. The incident highlighted the need for better communication between mental health professionals, law enforcement, and the public to prevent individuals like Long from slipping through the cracks. Despite the public outcry and the growing demand for change, the response from lawmakers in the aftermath of the shooting was slow and fragmented. While some politicians and activists called for stronger gun control measures, including background checks for all firearms sales, restrictions on assault weapons, and a ban on high-capacity magazines, the issue remained highly politicized. Pro-gun advocacy groups, such as the National Rifle Association (NRA), continued to resist calls for stricter regulations, arguing that the right to bear arms was a fundamental part of American identity. This deep division over gun control made it difficult for lawmakers to reach consensus on meaningful reforms. While federal action on gun control stalled, local communities, especially in California, began to take action to address the aftermath of the shooting and prevent future violence. In Thousand Oaks, residents, survivors, and the families of victims came together to support each other and to advocate for changes in both mental health and gun laws. Local organizations raised awareness about the need for better mental health care and improved resources for those in crisis. Several survivors of the Borderline Bar and Grill shooting also became vocal advocates for gun control, sharing their experiences to push for stronger regulations and to ensure that the lives lost that night were not forgotten. As the months went by, the victims' families and survivors began to heal, but the emotional scars of the shooting remained. Memorial services were held for the victims, and a permanent tribute was established in Thousand Oaks to honor the lives lost. The community came together to remember the 12 people who had been taken too soon, including a number of college students who were simply out for a night of fun. Their deaths were a tragic reminder that gun violence could strike anywhere, even in a seemingly safe community like Thousand Oaks. The legal process surrounding the shooting also continued to unfold, with law enforcement agencies working to piece together a fuller understanding of Long's background and the events leading up to the attack. The question of how to prevent future mass shootings remained unanswered, with no easy solutions in sight. However, the conversation sparked by the Borderline Bar and Grill shooting continued to evolve, with survivors and advocates pressing for reforms that could prevent similar tragedies. In the end, the shooting at the Borderline Bar and Grill was yet another heartbreaking example of the deadly consequences of gun violence in America. It served as a reminder of the importance of addressing both the availability of firearms and the mental health issues that often contribute to mass shootings. While the response to the shooting was slow and complex, it sparked conversations that would continue to shape the national dialogue on gun control and mental health for years to come. The tragedy also highlighted the need for greater unity in addressing the root causes of gun violence and the urgent need for action to protect communities across the United States. As the survivors and families of the victims continued their fight for justice and reform, they hoped that their efforts would prevent another senseless loss of life and create a safer future for all.